The doors of the great hall slammed open before Elena Hart could steady her breath, and every head in the crowded room turned toward her at once. She felt the weight of 100 stares land on her skin, like sudden heat from a fire that had been lit only to burn her. Damian Cross stood at the far end of the hall, tall and rigid in his dark ceremonial coat, the coat that marked him as Alpha King of a pack that had trusted him with their future. Beside him stood Serafina Vale, chin lifted, a smile already curling at the edge of her mouth, as though she had already claimed a victory that had not yet been spoken aloud. Elena kept walking, because there was nothing else left to do. A message had arrived that morning, brief and vague, summoning every member of the pack to the hall before midday. She had read it twice, then a third time, searching for some detail that might soften the dread coiling in her stomach. There had been none. She had simply dressed, walked out of her small house at the edge of the territory, and made her way here, already half certain of what was coming, though some stubborn part of her had hoped, right up until the doors opened, that she was wrong. She was not wrong. She stopped a few feet from Damian, and waited, her hands loosely at her sides, her spine straight despite the tremor she refused to let travel any farther than her fingertips. He did not look away from her. His jaw was set tight, his hands clasped behind his back in the exact posture he used whenever he wanted to appear calm and in control. She had learned that posture across 2 years of being his mate. She recognized it now for exactly what it was, a mask worn by a man who did not want anyone to see what lay beneath it. Elena Hart. His voice rolled through the hall without needing to be raised, carrying the particular authority that came from being born to lead, and trained his entire life to never sound uncertain. Before this pack and its elders, I release you from our mate bond. The words dropped into the silence like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples through the crowd that gathered around them. Somewhere behind her, a woman gasped. Somewhere else, a name was whispered, though Elena could not tell whose name it was, or whether it was even hers. She did not turn to look. She kept her eyes fixed on Damian's face, searching it for some crack, some flicker of hesitation, anything that might suggest this was costing him even a fraction of what it was costing her. She found nothing. Only the practiced stillness of a king, performing the role his position demanded of him. I have chosen Serafina Vale to stand beside me as my future queen, Damian continued, his voice steady, unwavering, terrible in its calm. This choice serves the pack. It secures alliances we cannot afford to lose, alliances that will protect every family gathered in this hall today. Serafina's smile widened, though she kept her gaze politely lowered, the picture of humility for anyone not paying close enough attention. Elena noticed the way her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her gown, as though she were resisting the urge to reach for Damian's arm, before the announcement had been made official, before the moment truly belonged to her. Elena had imagined this exact scene more times than she wanted to admit, in the long, quiet hours of the night when doubt crept through the cracks of her composure uninvited. She had imagined herself crying in front of the entire pack, or falling to her knees, or begging Damian to reconsider in front of witnesses who would never let her forget the sound of her own voice breaking. She had imagined the whispers that would follow her for months, the pity in some eyes and the satisfaction in others. But now that the moment had finally arrived, none of those things happened. She simply stood there, spine straight, chin level, and let his words settle over her, the way dust settles after a long fall. She did not blink rapidly to hold back tears that threatened to spill. She did not reach for anyone's hand for support, though Clara Bennett stood somewhere near the back of the crowd, close enough to catch her if her knees buckled. She looked at Damian, held his gaze for one long, unbearable second, and then nodded, slow and deliberate, the way a person nods when they have heard exactly what they expected to hear, and refused to give it any more power over them than it already claimed. Then she turned, and she walked out of the hall. The silence that trailed behind her was heavier than any sound could have been. She heard her own footsteps echo against the cold stone floor, steady and unhurried, carrying her toward the tall doors at the far end of the room. She felt the eyes of the entire pack following her every step of the way, and still she did not look back, did not falter, did not let her pace quicken even slightly. She simply walked, because walking was the only thing left for her to do, and because some quiet, unshakable part of her had already decided, long before this exact day arrived, that she would not give this room, or this man, the satisfaction of watching her come apart. Outside, the cold morning air struck her face like a slap that somehow steadied rather than wounded her. She finally allowed herself one long, shuddering breath, deep and slow, filling her lungs until her chest ached with the effort of holding herself together. She pressed her palm flat against the rough stone wall beside the entrance and closed her eyes for a single moment, only a moment, before straightening her shoulders again and continuing down the path that led toward the small house at the edge of the packlands. The same house that had been hers before Damien, and would now, apparently, be hers again. Inside the hall, the murmurs had already begun to swell into something louder, more urgent. Pack members turned toward one another, trading confused, searching glances, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. They had expected tears. They had expected a scene worthy of retelling for weeks, months even, a story that would grow more dramatic with each new voice that carried it forward. Instead, they had watched a woman absorb a public humiliation with nothing more than a single measured nod, and something about the sheer restraint of it unsettled them more deeply than any outburst could have. Damien remained standing exactly where he was, his hands still clasped behind his back, though his knuckles had gone white from the pressure of his own grip. He watched the doors long after Elena had vanished through them, as though some foolish part of him still expected her to return, to say something, anything, to give him the reaction he had spent weeks bracing himself to receive. She did not come back. Serafina touched his arm gently, her fingers cool against the sleeve of his coat, drawing his attention away from the doors that refused to open again. "It is done," she said softly, her voice full of quiet satisfaction. "You made the right choice, my lord. The alliance with my family will strengthen this pack for generations to come." Damien nodded, though the motion felt strangely hollow, as though his body were performing agreement, while some other part of him remained rooted to the spot Elena had occupied only moments before. He accepted the congratulations of the elders who approached him one after another, their voices thick with practiced admiration for a decision they believed to be wise, necessary, unavoidable. His mind kept circling back to the sound of Elena's footsteps fading down the length of the hall, steady and unbroken, and to the strange, cold weight that had settled into his chest the exact moment she chose to nod at him instead of weeping. He had known Elena for years before she ever became his mate. He had watched her grow from a quiet, watchful girl into a woman who carried herself with a calm confidence that few others in the pack ever managed to match. He had chosen the bond with her not because of some overwhelming, consuming pull the old stories described, but out of genuine respect, out of a growing sense that she was steady in exactly the way he needed someone beside him to be steady as he shouldered the crushing weight of leadership. Over time, that respect had deepened into something he had never quite found the courage to name, even privately, even to himself in the dark hours before sleep. And now he had let her go, in front of the entire pack, for reasons that made perfect sense laid out on paper. Serafina's family controlled trade routes through the eastern territories that his pack desperately needed to secure. Her father had made it unmistakably clear that a formal alliance through marriage was the price of continued cooperation. The elders had pressed him for months, warning him again and again that without this alliance, the pack would face shortages, rising tension with rival packs, perhaps even open conflict along the borders. Every argument had pointed in the same direction. Every argument had told him this was the only responsible choice available to him. None of those arguments explained why he felt, standing in the aftermath of his own carefully delivered announcement, as though he had just made the single greatest mistake of his entire life. That night, long after the celebrations following the announcement had finally quieted and the great hall had emptied of its last lingering guests, Damien found himself standing alone at the window of his private chambers, staring out over the sprawling packlands toward the small cluster of houses gathered at the far edge of the territory. He could not actually see Elena's house from this distance, not really, the darkness swallowing the details of rooftops and paths alike, but he found his eyes drifting toward that direction anyway, again and again, as though some stubborn part of him remained convinced that a reaction was coming, that it simply hadn't arrived yet. He told himself that her silence meant nothing at all, that she had simply accepted the inevitable, the way any sensible, practical person eventually learns to accept things they cannot change, that she had not cared enough to fight for what they once shared, and that her composure was, if anything, proof that ending the bond had been the correct decision after all, a mercy rather than a wound. He repeated these thoughts to himself several times over, testing each one, waiting for even a single one of them to settle comfortably into place. None of them settled. They sat uneasily in his mind instead, refusing to take root no matter how many times he turned them over, and he found himself pacing the length of his chambers long into the deepest hours of the night, unable to shake the image of Elena's calm, unreadable face, her single measured nod, the steady, unhurried sound of her footsteps carrying her away from him without the slightest hint of hesitation. Meanwhile, in the small house at the edge of the Packlands, Elena sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, slowly going cold in front of her, untouched, forgotten the moment she poured it. Her closest friend, Clara Bennett, had arrived within the hour, having heard the news from at least 3 different sources, before Elena herself had even made it home. Clara sat across from her now, worry etched into every line of her face, watching Elena with the careful, guarded attention of someone braced to catch a friend, who might shatter at any moment without warning. "You don't have to pretend with me," Clara said gently, reaching across the table to rest her hand near Elena's, close enough to offer comfort without forcing it. "I know exactly what just happened to you. You can cry, you can scream, if that's what you need. I won't think any less of you for it, not for one single second." Elena wrapped both hands around the cooling teacup and considered the offer for a long, quiet moment. Part of her almost wished she could take it, wished the tears would finally come the way everyone around her seemed to expect them to. But when she searched inside herself for that particular grief, reaching down past the ache in her chest and the tightness in her throat, she found something else waiting there instead. Not the absence of pain, exactly. Not numbness, but a strange, clear-eyed steadiness that surprised even her. A steadiness she had not known she possessed until this exact moment demanded it of her. "I'm not pretending," she said finally, her voice quiet but sure. "I think I knew this was coming for a long time now. Longer than I ever let myself admit, even to you. And I think if I cry now, in front of him, in front of the whole pack, I give him something. I give all of them something to hold on to. A story they can tell for years, about the poor woman who fell apart the moment her mate chose someone else over her." She shook her head slowly, her grip on the teacup tightening just slightly. "I don't want to be that story, Clara. I refuse to be that story." Clara studied her for a long moment, then reached across the table and squeezed her hand firmly. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, but it is all right to hurt, Elena. Strength and hurting were never opposites. You can hold both at once." "I know," Elena said quietly, her eyes finally glistening, though the tears refused to fall. "I am hurting. I just don't need anyone else to witness it in order for it to be real to me." They sat together in a comfortable, familiar silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have known each other long enough to no longer require constant conversation to feel close. Eventually, Clara asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the moment she first arrived. "What will you do now?" Elena had already been turning that exact question over in her mind since the instant she walked out of the great hall, her footsteps still echoing faintly in her memory. The Packlands had been her home for her entire life, every path familiar, every face recognizable, but there seemed little reason left to stay now, tied as she was to a place that would forever be shaped by the memory of today. She thought of the small, modest savings she had carefully built over the years, enough perhaps, to start something new, somewhere far from here. She thought of the skills she carried, quiet things, practical things, the kind that could help her build an entirely new life in a town where no one knew her name, her history, or the particular shape of the humiliation she had endured today. "I think I am going to leave," she said finally. "Not tomorrow, not even next week most likely, but soon. I want to build something that belongs entirely to me, somewhere far away, somewhere no one is watching closely, to see whether I finally break." Clara nodded slowly, understanding written plainly across her features, even as sadness crept steadily into her eyes, at the thought of her closest friend, leaving the only home either of them had ever known. "Then I will help you plan it properly," she said. "Whatever you need from me, you have it." Elena managed a small, genuine smile then, the very first real one since she had walked into the great hall earlier that afternoon. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not asking me to be someone I am not tonight. Outside, The moon had risen fully over the packlands, casting pale silver light across the rooftops and the quiet, winding paths that connected the scattered houses of the territory. In his chambers across the sprawling grounds, Damien remained fixed at his window, still watching the darkness in the direction of a house he could not truly see, still turning over a silence he could not begin to explain away, no matter how many convenient reasons he offered himself in its place. He did not yet understand what that silence truly meant. He only knew, with a growing unease that refused to leave him no matter how late the hour grew, that something about tonight had shifted in a way he could not simply undo by repeating to himself that he had made the correct, necessary choice. The celebrations had ended hours ago. The alliance had been formally announced before the entire pack. Serafina had smiled at him with the deep satisfaction of a woman who had won precisely what she had spent months working to secure. And yet Damien Cross, alpha king of a pack that answered to his every command, stood entirely alone in his chambers, feeling as though he had lost something he would spend a very long time trying to properly name, let alone recover. Word of what had happened in the Great Hall spread through the packlands faster than any messenger could have carried it on foot. By the following morning, it seemed as though every household within the territory had already heard some version of the story, each retelling shifting slightly further from the truth than the last. Some claimed Elena had smiled as Damien spoke, as though she had welcomed her own dismissal. Others insisted she had trembled so badly she nearly collapsed before reaching the doors, a detail invented entirely out of the need for drama rather than any accuracy. The truth, plain and unremarkable as it was, seemed to satisfy almost no one. Elena felt the weight of those rumors the moment she stepped outside her house to fetch water from the well nearest the village square. Neighbors who had greeted her warmly for years now offered only quick, uncertain nods before hurrying past, unwilling to meet her eyes for longer than courtesy strictly required. A cluster of younger pack members, gathered near the bakery, fell into abrupt silence as she approached, their whispered conversation cutting off so sharply that its absence felt louder than anything they might have said aloud. She did not let any of it show on her face. She drew her water, exchanged a few brief, ordinary words with the baker about the price of grain, and walked back toward her house, with the same measured, unhurried pace she had used to leave the Great Hall the day before. It cost her more effort than she let anyone see, each step a small, private battle against the urge to hunch her shoulders or lower her gaze, the way the whispers seemed to expect of her. She refused to give them that satisfaction either. Clara found her later that afternoon, sitting on the low stone step outside her front door, watching the clouds shift slowly overhead. "I heard what people are saying," Clara said, settling down beside her without waiting for an invitation. "None of it sounds like you." "It never does," Elena said, a faint, tired edge of dry humor slipping into her voice despite everything. "People need a story to make sense of what they don't understand. I suppose I've simply become theirs for a while." "It will pass," Clara offered, though even she seemed uncertain of the promise as she made it. "Maybe," Elena said. "Or maybe I'll be gone before it does, and it won't matter either way." Across the territory, in the far more guarded quiet of his own chambers, Damien faced a very different kind of scrutiny. The elders who had gathered to celebrate his announcement the previous evening now returned throughout the day, with a steady stream of practical matters requiring his attention, treaty language to review, border patrols to reassign, wedding preparations to discuss with representatives from Serafina's family. He moved through each conversation with the appearance of full attention, nodding at the appropriate moments, offering brief, measured responses that satisfied whoever stood before him. Inside, his thoughts remained elsewhere entirely. He kept replaying the exact moment Elena's eyes had met his, that single breath before she nodded, searching his memory for anything he might have missed, any flicker of emotion beneath her composure that he had simply failed to notice in the moment itself. He found nothing new no matter how many times he returned to it, and the not knowing gnawed at him more persistently than any grief he might have expected to feel over ending a bond he had convinced himself was necessary to end. Serafina noticed his distraction almost immediately, though she said little about it that first day, choosing instead to focus her attention on the practical details of securing her new position within the pack. She met with the elders to discuss formal wedding preparations, toured the private chambers that would soon become hers, and accepted the careful congratulations of pack members eager to align themselves with the future queen. If she noticed the way conversations sometimes paused when Elena's name arose nearby, she gave no outward sign of concern, confident that whatever lingering sentiment remained would fade quickly enough once the wedding was formally underway. That evening, Damien sought out one of his oldest advisors, a steady, thoughtful man who had served his father before him, hoping for some counsel that might ease the unease sitting heavily in his chest. The old advisor listened patiently, as Damien described, in careful, guarded terms, his unease over how the previous day's announcement had unfolded. "You did what the pack required of you," the advisor said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "There is no shame in a difficult decision made for the good of many, even when it costs something precious to you personally. Then why does it feel less like relief and more like regret?" Damien asked, the question slipping out before he could soften it into something more diplomatic. The old advisor studied him for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps because you have not yet allowed yourself to fully consider what it is you actually chose, and what it is you gave up in choosing it. That reckoning rarely arrives on the same day as the decision itself. Sometimes it takes far longer to catch up." Damien carried those words with him long after the conversation ended, turning them over throughout the remainder of a restless night that offered him little genuine sleep. He rose before dawn, dressed without waking his attendants, and walked alone along the quiet paths bordering the packlands, needing the cold morning air and the solitude more than he needed any further counsel from anyone else. He did not walk toward Elena's house, not exactly, though his path curved closer to that side of the territory than strict necessity required, and he told himself, unconvincingly, that this was simply the route his feet had chosen at random. By the time the sun had fully risen, casting long amber light across the frost-covered grass, Damien had reached no clear resolution, only a growing, uncomfortable certainty that the reckoning his advisor had warned him about was already well underway, whether he was ready to face it or not. He turned back toward his own chambers at last, the weight of the previous day's silence still following him with every step, refusing, stubbornly, to loosen its grip. The training grounds rang with the sharp clash of practice blades as Damien stood near the edge of the field, watching a group of young pack warriors spar without truly seeing any of it. His mind kept drifting back to a conversation he had overheard the previous evening, two elders murmuring near the archive room, wondering aloud whether Elena's composure meant she had never valued the bond as deeply as everyone had assumed. The words bothered him more than he expected them to. He found himself wanting to correct the elders, to explain that Elena's silence had nothing to do with indifference, though he could not have said with any real certainty what it actually meant. He simply knew, with an instinct he trusted more than he wanted to admit, that they were wrong about her. Serafina found him there an hour later, still distracted, his responses to her questions arriving a beat too late, his eyes drifting toward the horizon more often than they settled comfortably on her face. She noticed, though she said nothing about it at first, choosing instead to link her arm through his and steer the conversation gently toward wedding preparations, toward the celebrations already being planned by her family for the months ahead. "My father wishes to hold the formal ceremony within the month," she said, watching him carefully for his reaction as they walked together along the edge of the field. "He believes moving quickly will send a clear message to the Eastern Pacts that this alliance is solid, unshakable, not open to question." Damien nodded slowly, though the proposed timeline felt sudden to him, almost aggressive in its speed. "A month is very soon," he said. "There are matters within the pact that require attention first. Territory boundaries still under dispute, trade agreements with the northern settlements that remain unfinished." "Those matters can wait a little longer," Serafina said smoothly, her tone light but firm beneath its warmth. "This cannot. The sooner the pact sees us formally bound together, the sooner any lingering doubts about your judgment will finally fade away." Something in her phrasing caught his attention immediately, the quiet implication that his judgment had already been questioned somewhere, that whispers of doubt were already circulating among the pack. He wondered, not for the first time since the announcement, how much of this urgency stemmed from genuine strategic necessity, and how much came simply from Serafina's own desire to secure her new position before anything unexpected had the chance to shift beneath her. He did not voice that thought aloud. Instead, he simply nodded again, agreeing to discuss the timeline further with the elders in the coming days, and watched Serafina's satisfied smile settle firmly into place before she excused herself to continue with her ongoing preparations. Elena, meanwhile, had already begun the formal process of requesting a full release from her remaining ties to the pack. She met with the Council of Elders on a cool, overcast afternoon, presenting her request with the same measured, unhurried calm she had shown in the Great Hall days earlier. She explained her intention to relocate, to build an entirely new life somewhere far from the territory, and asked plainly for the customary release granted to former mates who wished to establish full independence from the pack. The elders exchanged uncertain glances before responding to her request. One of them, a stern, careful woman who had served on the council for longer than Elena had been alive, spoke first, her tone measured and deliberately gentle. "Your request is understood, Elena Hart. However, there are matters that complicate a swift and simple release." Elena tilted her head slightly, waiting patiently for whatever clarification might follow. "Your family's bloodline carries certain historical ties to territories along the eastern border," the elder continued carefully. "Ties that predate even your bond with Alpha Cross by several generations. There are old agreements, obligations connected to your lineage that were never formally addressed during your time as his mate. Your sudden departure now, combined with the ending of the bond that once quietly anchored those obligations to this pack, may create serious complications with allies who have long assumed those ties remained secure and unchanged." Elena had heard fragments of this old history before, distant stories about ancestors who had once negotiated boundaries and agreements on behalf of the pack, but she had never imagined those arrangements might still carry real weight generations later, let alone weight significant enough to delay her own departure. She asked for further clarification, and the elders explained, in careful, diplomatic language, that a full and formal release could not be granted until the political implications had been properly reviewed and thoroughly addressed by the council. It was not the answer she had hoped to hear. She had imagined a clean, quiet departure, entirely free from entanglements, free from any lingering reason to remain near Damien or the life she was actively trying to leave behind her for good. Instead, she found herself being asked to stay, at least temporarily, until the entire matter could be properly resolved. She left the council chamber that afternoon, with a tightness in her chest she had not felt since the night of the rejection itself. It was not grief this time, exactly, but frustration, a growing sense that even her own attempt to reclaim control over her life was already being complicated by forces she had never chosen to involve herself with in the first place. Clara was waiting for her just outside the chamber, having accompanied her to the meeting for quiet support. She read the frustration plainly on Elena's face the moment she stepped through the door. "What happened in there?" Elena explained the situation as they walked slowly back toward her house together, her voice steady, even as her thoughts churned uneasily beneath the surface. "I have to stay, at least for now, until they sort out whatever old agreements are tied to my family's bloodline." "For how long?" Clara asked. "They didn't say exactly. Weeks, perhaps, maybe longer than that." Elena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain outwardly calm despite the frustration steadily building inside her chest. "I suppose I should have expected something like this. Nothing about my life these past few days has gone anywhere close to how I planned it." Clara squeezed her arm gently as they walked. "At least you're not being asked to stay because of him directly. This is separate, political, not personal, whatever it might feel like right now." Elena nodded, though a small, uncomfortable part of her wondered whether the two could truly be separated as easily as Clara suggested, given that any dealings with the Eastern Territories would inevitably require conversations with the very pack leadership Damien now headed, whether either of them wanted that or not. She was right to wonder. Word of the complication reached Damien within days, delivered by the same elders who had informed Elena of the delay. They explained the situation to him with the same careful, diplomatic language they had used with her, emphasizing the strategic importance of resolving the matter thoroughly, rather than rushing Elena's departure, and risking real damage to old alliances the pack had quietly relied upon for generations, without much thought. Damien listened to the full explanation, with an attention that visibly surprised the elders delivering it. He asked more questions than the situation strictly required, pressing carefully for details about the expected timeline, about precisely what would need to happen before the matter could be considered fully resolved. The elders, mistaking his interest for diligent, responsible leadership, answered thoroughly and at length, unaware that his real focus had considerably less to do with strategic necessity, and far more to do with the simple fact that Elena would now remain within the Packlands for the foreseeable future, rather than disappearing from his life entirely within days. He told himself this was simply prudent oversight, the kind of careful attention any responsible leader would naturally give to a complicated political matter touching old alliances. He told himself this had nothing whatsoever to do with the quiet, unwelcome relief that had washed over him the moment he learned Elena would not be leaving right away after all. He was not entirely convincing, even to himself, no matter how many times he repeated the reasoning. Over the following days, circumstances began arranging themselves in ways that brought Damien and Elena into contact far more often than either of them particularly wanted. The council decided that resolving the Eastern Territory matter properly would require direct input from both parties, given that the historical agreements had once been tied to the bond between them, however indirectly that connection now stood. Meetings were scheduled, documents required careful review. Signatures were needed from both former mates in order to formally separate the old political obligations from a personal bond that no longer legally existed between them. Their first formal meeting took place in a small council chamber, deliberately businesslike, with an elder present throughout to mediate the discussion and keep it firmly on track. Elena arrived precisely on time, dressed simply, her expression composed in the same steady way it had been in the great hall weeks earlier. Damien arrived only moments after her, and for one brief instant, before either of them managed to adjust their expressions into something more carefully neutral, their eyes met across the room and held there just a beat too long. Neither of them spoke first. The elder cleared his throat, breaking the silence deliberately, and began outlining the various documents that would need careful review over the coming sessions. Elena and Damien both turned their full attention toward the papers spread across the table, though Damien found his focus repeatedly drifting back toward Elena's steady, unhurried hands as she read through each page with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She addressed him formally throughout the entire meeting, using his title rather than his given name, maintaining a careful professional distance that felt, to Damien, like a wall deliberately constructed between them, brick by brick, with every polite, measured word. He found himself wanting to break through that wall somehow, though he could not have easily explained why, given that he himself was the one who had built the original distance between them, by choosing Serafina in front of the entire watching pack. "These terms seem reasonable enough," Elena said finally, sliding one of the documents back across the table toward him. "I have no real objections to this particular section." "Good," Damien said, his voice steadier than he actually felt in that moment. "We should be able to finish the full review within a few more sessions, if you remain available in the coming weeks." "I'm available," Elena said simply, without offering any further elaboration, and returned her full attention to the next document waiting in the stack between them. The meeting continued in much the same careful manner for its remaining hour, professional and tightly controlled, though Damien found himself noticing small details he had not paid close attention to in what felt like a very long time. The way Elena's brow furrowed slightly whenever she concentrated deeply on a difficult passage. The unhurried, deliberate way she moved through each page, never rushing, never careless, always thorough. He had somehow forgotten how steady she truly was, how grounded, and being near that particular steadiness again, after weeks of Serafina's more demanding, more insistent presence, felt oddly like stepping into cooler air, after spending too long trapped in oppressive heat. He caught himself lingering on that thought and pushed it firmly aside, uncomfortable with exactly where it seemed determined to lead him. When the meeting finally ended, Elena gathered her copies of the reviewed documents and rose from her seat without lingering unnecessarily. She offered the mediating elder a polite word of thanks and turned toward the door, pausing only briefly once she reached it. "Alpha Cross," she said, using his title with the same careful formality she had maintained throughout the entire session. "I trust we can keep these remaining sessions efficient. I would like this matter fully resolved as quickly as reasonably possible." "Of course," Damien said, though something tightened uncomfortably in his chest at the clear implication behind her words, the plain suggestion that she wanted to leave, that her continued presence here was simply a temporary obligation, rather than anything she genuinely welcomed. She left without another word, and Damien remained seated at the long table, long after the elder had also quietly departed, staring at the closed door, turning her brief request over carefully in his mind. He wanted the matter resolved quickly too, he told himself firmly. Of course he did. It was the only responsible thing to want, given everything at stake. But some quieter, more honest part of him was already beginning to dread the day the paperwork would finally be finished. The day the last remaining excuse for Elena to stay anywhere nearby would disappear completely, leaving her finally free to leave the Packlands behind and build the entirely new life she had spoken of so plainly, weeks earlier, in that same council chamber. That evening, Serafina noticed the distraction in him again, more pronounced than it had been before, and this time she asked directly whether something was troubling him. Damien offered a vague answer about the ongoing complexities of the Eastern Territory negotiations, careful not to mention Elena by name, any more than the conversation strictly required. Serafina studied him for a long moment, her expression difficult to read, before finally letting the matter drop without further pressing. But later, alone in her own private chambers, she found herself thinking again about the council meetings scheduled between Damien and Elena, about the timeline that suddenly seemed far less certain than it had appeared only a week earlier, and a small, sharp seed of unease began quietly taking root somewhere in the back of her mind. She had won, she reminded herself firmly. She had secured the alliance, the title, the position she had worked toward for years, through careful patience and calculated effort. But something about the way Damien's attention kept drifting, kept returning again and again to a woman he claimed to have released without any lingering regret, told her, on some instinctive level she did not fully welcome, that her victory might not be quite as complete or as settled as she had allowed herself to believe. She resolved quietly and privately to watch the situation more closely going forward. She began paying careful attention to the exact days and times of the council sessions scheduled between Damien and Elena, noting how each one seemed to run slightly longer than the practical matter of old documents should reasonably require. She said nothing of this to Damien directly, unwilling to reveal her own uncertainty, but she found herself, more than once, standing near the corridor outside the council chamber, at the hour a session was due to end, waiting to observe Damien's expression the moment he emerged. What she saw troubled her more than she wanted to admit, even to herself. He did not emerge looking relieved, the way a man finishing a tedious but necessary obligation might reasonably look. He emerged looking thoughtful, distracted, his eyes often lingering on the closed door behind him a moment longer than seemed entirely natural. Meanwhile, in the small house at the edge of the Packlands, Elena sat once again with Clara, discussing the strange, unwelcome delay in her plans to finally leave the territory behind. Clara listened patiently, as Elena described the growing frustration of being caught, once again, in circumstances she had never chosen and could not easily control. "It feels like the pack keeps finding new reasons to keep me here," Elena admitted, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. First the bond, now old agreements, tied to a bloodline I barely knew existed until a council of elders told me about it. "Do you think there's any part of you that's relieved by the delay?" Clara asked gently, watching her friend's face carefully for any flicker of honest reaction. Elena considered the question longer than she expected to need. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I want to say no. I want to say I'm simply frustrated, and nothing more complicated than that. But if I'm being completely honest with you, I'm not entirely certain that's the whole truth anymore." Clara did not press her further, sensing that Elena herself was still working through the answer, still uncertain of exactly what she felt beneath the careful composure she showed to everyone, including, sometimes, herself. They sat together quietly for a while longer, the fire crackling softly in the small hearth, neither of them rushing to fill the comfortable silence with words that weren't yet ready to be spoken. Elena thought, in the quiet that followed, of how strange it felt to sit across a table from Damien now, discussing old documents and border agreements with careful professional distance, when only weeks earlier, he had stood before the entire pack and ended everything between them without warning. She had built her plans for leaving around the assumption that she would never need to see him again, not closely, not regularly, not in a way that required her to sit near him and watch his hands move across pages the way she remembered from easier days. The unexpected delay had unraveled that assumption entirely, and she was still learning how to navigate a version of her life she had never planned to face. Unbeknownst to her, similar uncertainty was unraveling steadily within Damien as well, though he kept his own turmoil carefully hidden behind the composed authority his position demanded of him at every hour of the day. He had begun, without fully admitting it to himself, looking forward to the council sessions in a way that troubled him deeply, whenever he allowed himself to examine the feeling too closely. He told himself, again and again, that his interest remained purely political, purely strategic, purely about resolving a complicated matter properly, for the good of the pack. The lie grew harder to maintain with each passing session, though he was not yet ready to abandon it entirely, not while Serafina's family still expected a wedding within the month, not while the political consequences of any hesitation on his part remained so steep and so immediate. He continued moving forward with the appearance of full commitment to the path he had already publicly chosen, even as something quieter and more honest continued stirring beneath that careful surface, waiting for the moment it would finally demand to be acknowledged. The council chamber had become a familiar space over the following 2 weeks, its long wooden table now marked in Elena's mind by the particular slant of light that fell through its narrow windows each afternoon around the same hour. She arrived for each session precisely on time, documents in hand, her manner unfailingly professional, and each time she left just as promptly, offering no more warmth than the strict business of the meeting required. Damien had come to anticipate these sessions in a way he found increasingly difficult to justify to himself, no matter how many careful explanations he offered in private. He told himself it was simply the natural interest any responsible leader would take in resolving a complicated political matter touching on old alliances. He told himself many things during those 2 weeks, and the gap between what he told himself and what he actually felt continued widening with each passing day, until even his most convincing excuses began to feel thin and unconvincing, even to his own ears. It was during the 7th session, as they worked carefully through a particularly dense section of the historical agreements tied to Elena's bloodline, that the conversation shifted unexpectedly, beyond the strict boundaries of business they had both maintained so carefully until then. The elder mediating their meetings had been called away briefly to attend to another urgent matter elsewhere in the hall, leaving Damien and Elena alone together in the chamber for the very first time since the sessions had begun weeks earlier. The silence that followed his departure stretched longer than either of them seemed willing to break first. Elena continued reading through the document in front of her, though Damien noticed, watching her closely, that her eyes had stopped moving across the page several lines back, as though her attention had drifted somewhere else entirely, despite her outward composure remaining perfectly intact. "You've been thorough with all of this," he said finally, gesturing toward the growing stack of reviewed documents between them. "More thorough than most people would bother being, given the circumstances surrounding all of it." Elena looked up at him then, her expression carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "I like to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to, before I put my name to it. That much about me hasn't changed, whatever else has." There was something in the way she said it, a quiet edge running beneath the calm surface of her words, that told him she meant considerably more than simply the documents spread out in front of them. He felt the weight of the implication settle heavily over him, though he did not immediately know how to respond to it directly, without opening a conversation he was not entirely certain he felt ready to have. Not yet, not here. "Elena," he said, and her given name felt strange and unfamiliar in his mouth, after so many weeks of careful titles and deliberate formal distance between them. "I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll answer honestly, whatever the answer turns out to be." She set down the document she had been holding and folded her hands together on the table, waiting patiently for whatever question he intended to ask. "Why didn't you react, that night in the hall?" he asked, the question finally spoken aloud, after weeks of turning it over privately in his own mind. Everyone expected tears. Some of them wanted them, I think, though none would ever admit that openly. But you just nodded, and walked away without another word. "I've thought about it more than I probably should have, and I still don't fully understand it." Elena considered the question for a long, thoughtful moment before answering, her steady gaze never leaving his face. "Do you want the honest answer, or the answer that would make you feel better about everything?" "The honest one," he said, without a moment of hesitation. "I didn't cry because I refused to give you, or anyone else gathered in that room, the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of them," she said, her voice quiet, but unshakably certain. "You made your choice, you had your reasons, and I understood them, even if I never fully agreed with them. But my reaction that day was mine alone to control, and I had already decided, whatever else happened, that I would not let it become the single moment that defined me as broken, in front of an entire pack." Damien absorbed her words slowly, feeling the plain truth of them settle into places within himself he had not expected them to reach. It wasn't weakness then, I thought, for a while afterward, that maybe it meant you didn't care nearly as much as I had always believed you did. It was the exact opposite of weakness, Elena said, her voice steadier now, but carrying a quiet weight she rarely allowed herself to fully show anyone, even Clara. It took everything I had in me to walk out of that hall without breaking down in front of everyone watching, but I had already decided, long before that particular day arrived, that I would never let anyone else's decision about me determine how I felt about myself afterward. My worth was never something you had the power to reject, Damien, even though you certainly had the power to end our bond whenever you chose. The words hung suspended in the quiet air between them, and Damien found himself entirely without a response for several long, heavy seconds. He had expected many possible answers when he finally worked up the nerve to ask his question, but not this one. Not this quiet, unshakable clarity that made him feel, for the first time since the night of the rejection itself, the full and complete weight of exactly what he had done to her. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words feeling somehow inadequate even as he spoke them aloud. "For how it happened. For the way I handled the entire situation. You deserved so much better than a sudden public announcement in front of the whole watching pack." Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his apology carefully against the memory of that night, against the weeks of quiet grief she had carried alone since then. "Apology accepted, for whatever it's worth to either of us now. But I don't need your regret in order to feel whole again, Damien. I've already found my own footing without it." The use of his given name again, rather than his formal title, struck him with unexpected force, a small but undeniable crack in the careful distance she had maintained so consistently throughout their sessions together. He wanted to ask her more, wanted desperately to understand exactly what she meant by finding her footing, whether it meant she had truly moved entirely past what happened between them, or whether the calm she showed so consistently was simply another form of the same quiet strength she had first shown him in that hall. Before he could ask anything further, the elder returned to the chamber, and the conversation shifted immediately back toward the documents spread across the table between them, the moment of unexpected honesty carefully tucked away, as though it had never happened at all. But something had undeniably shifted in the room during those few unguarded minutes, a subtle change in the air between them that neither Elena nor Damien could fully deny to themselves, even as they both returned to the careful, practiced professionalism that had defined every previous session. That night, Elena sat with Clara once again, though this time she found herself sharing more than she had originally intended about the unexpected conversation that had passed between herself and Damien earlier that afternoon. Clara listened without interrupting even once, her expression thoughtful as Elena carefully described the exchange, word by word, as accurately as she could remember it. "Do you think he's genuinely changed?" Clara asked, once Elena had finished her account. Elena considered the question with real care. "I don't know for certain. He seemed genuinely sorry, more so than I expected him to seem. But being sorry doesn't undo what already happened between us. And even if he truly has changed in some meaningful way, that doesn't automatically mean I should simply forget everything and go back to how things once were." "No one is asking you to do that," Clara said gently. "But it's all right to notice that things have shifted somehow, without needing to decide right away what that shift ultimately means for you." Elena nodded slowly, turning her friend's careful words over in her mind, long after Clara had finally gone home for the night. She had built her entire plan for the future around the idea of leaving, around starting completely fresh, somewhere the past could never quite follow her. The unexpected delay in that plan had frustrated her deeply at first, but she found herself, in quiet, honest moments like this one, growing less and less certain that leaving as quickly as possible remained the answer she genuinely wanted anymore. Across the sprawling packlands, Damien returned to his own chambers that evening, with Elena's words still echoing steadily through his mind. It wasn't weakness, it was the exact opposite of weakness. He thought of Serafina, of the confident, demanding presence she brought into every single room she entered, so entirely different from Elena's quiet, unshakable steadiness that had once anchored him through his most difficult days as a young alpha still learning how to lead. He had told himself, during those early days of choosing Serafina over Elena, that her ambition and drive would make her a genuinely strong queen, someone fully capable of standing firmly beside him, through whatever difficult decisions the future might demand of them both. He was beginning to understand now, slowly and uncomfortably, that real strength came in many different forms, and that he had perhaps badly mistaken sheer loudness for genuine strength, mistaken Serafina's constant insistence for true capability, while carelessly overlooking the quieter, far more enduring strength Elena had shown him so plainly in that hall weeks earlier, the strength that had refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. The growing realization troubled him more deeply than he wanted to admit, even to himself in the privacy of his own thoughts. He had made a public, formal commitment to Serafina, one tied directly to political alliances that affected the entire pack, not merely his own private feelings. Undoing that commitment now, even if some part of him genuinely wanted to, would not be a simple or painless matter, and he was not yet certain he was truly ready to consider such a drastic step, given absolutely everything currently at stake for the pack's future stability. But the seed of doubt that had first been planted in him on the very night of Elena's silent departure had just been given fresh, fertile ground in which to take root, even deeper than before. Serafina, for her own part, had not remained idle during these same difficult weeks. She had noticed the steady change in Damien's demeanor, the way his attention drifted more and more frequently, the way certain topics related to the Eastern Territory negotiations seemed to occupy far more of his focus than the situation itself genuinely warranted. She began making quiet, careful inquiries of her own, speaking discreetly with members of the council, gathering whatever information she could about exactly what these lengthy sessions between Damien and Elena actually entailed. What she managed to learn did little to ease the growing unease, steadily building within her. The sessions were, by every account she gathered, strictly professional in nature, focused entirely on resolving the historical bloodline agreements tied to Elena's family. But Serafina had built her entire position within the pack through careful strategy and precisely calculated moves, and she understood, better than most people around her, that professional distance could very easily mask far more complicated undercurrents running beneath its calm surface. She decided, after several restless nights of quiet consideration, that it was time to accelerate her own plans, to secure her position more firmly and more permanently before any lingering feelings between Damien and his former mate had the chance to fully develop into something that might genuinely threaten everything she had spent years carefully working to build for herself. She began pressing harder for an earlier wedding date, using every argument at her disposal to convince Damien that the pack's continued stability depended entirely on moving forward as quickly as possible. Damien found himself resisting her mounting pressure more than he had expected to, offering reasons rooted in practical, legitimate pack matters that, even to his own ears, sounded increasingly like carefully constructed excuses to delay a commitment he was growing less and less certain he genuinely wanted to make at all. Serafina noticed his resistance clearly, and it only deepened the unease that had been steadily building within her since the council sessions between Damien and Elena had first begun weeks earlier. Neither of them spoke directly, in those tense days, about the true underlying source of the tension quietly growing between them. But it sat there nonetheless, quiet and entirely unaddressed, waiting patiently for the moment it would eventually, inevitably, need to be confronted head-on by both of them. Meanwhile, the historical agreements tied to Elena's bloodline continued steadily revealing new complications that no one on the council had fully anticipated when the matter was first raised weeks earlier. Buried deep within old, dusty records, references began emerging to specific territorial rights that had never been formally transferred through proper channels, rights that, if left permanently unresolved, could genuinely destabilize relations with important allies along the entire eastern border. What had originally begun as a simple bureaucratic delay in Elena's planned departure was steadily proving to be a matter of genuine strategic importance, one that would require considerably more time and far more careful negotiation than anyone involved had initially believed necessary. Elena absorbed this steadily growing news with the same steady calm she brought to nearly everything else in her life, though privately, in the quiet hours alone in her small house, she found herself wondering with growing frequency exactly how much longer she would remain tied to this place, and to this man she had once been so entirely determined to leave behind for good. The weeks stretched slowly into what increasingly looked like it might become months, and with each passing council session, the careful, deliberate distance she had originally built between herself and Damien grew just a little bit harder to maintain fully intact. A pack gathering had been planned for the turning of the season, a modest but long-standing tradition meant to mark the shift from harvest into the colder months ahead. Elena had attended these gatherings every year of her life, and she saw no reason to break that habit now, even with everything that had changed around her in recent weeks. She told herself she would simply arrive, greet a few old friends, and leave early, before the evening grew too crowded or too complicated. The square had been strung with lanterns by the time she arrived, their warm light flickering against the gathering dusk, and the smell of roasted roots and fresh bread drifted from the long tables set along the edges of the gathering space. Clara found her almost immediately, looping an arm through hers and steering her toward a quieter corner near the edge of the crowd, away from the thickest press of people. "You didn't have to come," Clara said, though her tone carried more relief than concern. "I wanted to," Elena said simply. "I refused to let one difficult night keep me from the rest of my life. That was part of the point of walking out the way I did." They had not been standing there long, before Damien appeared near the far end of the square, drawn, as Alpha, into the traditional greetings and toasts expected of him at such gatherings. Elena watched him from a distance without quite meaning to, noting the practiced ease with which he moved through the crowd, exchanging brief words with elders and younger pack members alike, his public bearing as composed as always. Serafina walked beside him for a portion of the evening, though Elena noticed, with a detachment that surprised her, that the two of them did not stay close together for long. Serafina drifted off toward a cluster of her own family's representatives, leaving Damien to make his rounds largely alone, and Elena found herself wondering, briefly, what that small detail might mean, before deciding it was not truly any of her concern. Their paths crossed near the edge of the gathering, close enough to the lantern light that neither could easily pretend not to have noticed the other. Damien paused, offering her a brief, formal nod that mirrored, almost precisely, the one she had given him in the Great Hall weeks earlier. "Elena," he said, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry to anyone standing nearby. "Alpha Cross," she replied, matching his careful formality, though something in her tone lacked the sharp edge it might have carried a few weeks earlier. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said, and the simplicity of the statement, free of any deeper implication, seemed to surprise them both. The gathering wouldn't feel the same without familiar faces. "It's tradition," Elena said. "I wasn't going to let anything change that." He studied her for a moment longer than strict politeness required, then inclined his head and continued on his way through the crowd, leaving Elena standing quietly near the edge of the lantern light, Clara watching her carefully from a few steps away. "That was oddly civil," Clara observed once he had moved out of earshot. "It was," Elena agreed, turning the brief exchange over in her mind. "I don't know what to make of it yet." They stayed at the gathering for another hour, and Elena found herself, despite her earlier intention to leave early, reluctant to go. There was something steadying about the familiar rhythm of the evening, the same songs sung every year at this time, the same easy laughter drifting between neighbors who had known one another their entire lives. It reminded her, in a quiet way, of everything she stood to leave behind if she followed through with her original plan to build a new life elsewhere, and for the first time since the night of the rejection, she allowed herself to sit with that reminder, rather than push it firmly aside. Walking home later that night, the lantern light fading behind her and the cold air settling comfortably against her skin, Elena thought again of the brief exchange near the edge of the gathering, of the plain, unremarkable warmth in Damien's voice when he said he was glad she had come. It had not been a grand gesture, nor any kind of declaration. It had simply been honest, and something about its very simplicity lingered with her longer than any elaborate speech might have managed. She did not yet know what to do with that lingering warmth, and she was not entirely certain she wanted to examine it too closely, not while so much remained unresolved between them, and not while the wedding preparations for Damien and Serafina continued moving forward, however slowly, in the background of every other development unfolding around her. But she carried the moment with her nonetheless, tucked quietly alongside the growing uncertainty about her own plans to leave. One more small thread in a pattern she was only beginning to understand, she could no longer fully control through will alone. In the days that followed the gathering, Elena found herself paying closer attention to the small, ordinary details of her life that she had once taken for granted. The particular way morning light fell across the floor of her kitchen. The sound of Clara's laughter carrying through the thin walls of her house on the evenings they spent together. The familiar faces of neighbors who had known her since childhood, however awkward some of their recent interactions had become. She had spent weeks focused entirely on leaving, on building something new far away, and only now did she begin to notice how much quiet weight these ordinary things actually carried, how much of herself was woven into the fabric of this particular place. She mentioned this shift, carefully, to Clara one evening, unsure how to fully articulate what she was feeling even to herself. "I keep noticing things I never used to notice," she said, "as though some part of me is trying to memorize all of it, just in case." "In case you leave, or in case you decide to stay?" Clara asked gently. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Maybe both. Maybe I'm simply trying to be honest with myself about what I would actually be giving up, whichever choice I eventually make." Clara did not push her further, understanding that Elena needed the space to work through these questions at her own pace, without pressure from anyone, including her closest friend. They sat together quietly for a while, the fire crackling steadily in the hearth, and Elena found a measure of comfort in simply not needing to have every answer settled all at once. Meanwhile, the council sessions continued at their now familiar pace, each one bringing Damien and Elena into careful, professional contact that neither of them fully acknowledged had begun to matter more than either was willing to admit aloud. Damien found himself looking forward to these sessions with a steadily growing eagerness. He tried, with limited success, to keep hidden from everyone around him, including Serafina, whose careful observations had only grown sharper as the weeks continued passing. One afternoon, following a particularly long session focused on the finer details of territorial boundary language, Damien lingered in the council chamber after Elena had already gathered her documents and departed. He sat alone at the long table for a while, staring at the closed door, turning over the conversation they had shared weeks earlier, beneath the weight of her honest words about the night of the rejection. He thought of Serafina's mounting pressure for an earlier wedding date, of the elders who continued treating the upcoming marriage as a settled, uncomplicated matter, and of the growing unease that refused to leave him, no matter how many times he told himself he had made the responsible choice. He thought, too, of his father, long past now, who had once told him that leadership sometimes required sacrificing what one wanted personally for the sake of what the pack needed collectively. He had carried that lesson with him throughout every difficult decision of his time as Alpha, and he had believed, on the night he ended his bond with Elena, that he was finally living up to it fully. But sitting alone now in the quiet chamber, he found himself wondering, for the first time, whether his father had ever truly meant for that lesson to require sacrificing something as fundamental as honesty with oneself, or whether some sacrifices, however noble they appeared on the surface, ultimately cost more than they were ever worth to anyone involved, the pack included. He rose from the table eventually, gathering his own copies of the documents, and made his way back toward his chambers through the quiet, torch-lit corridors of the great hall, the same corridors that had once felt entirely familiar to him, and now, increasingly, felt like the walls of a decision he was no longer certain he had made correctly. Serafina Vale had not built her position within the pack through patience alone. She had learned early in life that opportunities rarely arrived on their own. They had to be created, shaped, and guided carefully toward the outcome one truly desired. It was this same sharp instinct that led her, on a quiet afternoon, to visit her father in his private study, seeking his counsel on how best to secure her engagement to Damien before anything had the chance to threaten it further. Her father, a shrewd man named Lucas Grant who had built his family's considerable influence through decades of careful trade negotiations, listened to his daughter's concerns without interrupting even once. When she finished explaining the growing delays in the wedding timeline and her mounting suspicions about the renewed contact between Damien and Elena, he steepled his fingers thoughtfully, considering the matter with the same careful calculation he applied to every important decision. "You worry over nothing yet," he said finally. "The Alpha has already made his public commitment before the entire pack. Reversing such a significant decision would cost him dearly among the elders and the pack alike. No leader undoes a solemn promise made before his own people without facing severe consequence to his authority and standing." "He hasn't reversed anything outright," Serafina admitted, though her voice carried a note of genuine unease she rarely allowed anyone to hear. "But his attention wavers more with each passing week. I see it every time her name is mentioned near him, even in passing. I need this wedding to happen before that wavering becomes something far more serious." Lucas Grant considered his daughter's words carefully, weighing the political risk of moving too quickly against the clear benefit of speed in securing what they had already worked so hard to achieve. "I will speak with the elders myself, quietly, in the coming days. There are ways to remind them of the genuine urgency behind this alliance, ways to make any further delay seem far more costly to the pack than moving forward with haste." What Serafina did not fully understand, in her focused determination to secure her own position, was how deeply her father's ambitions actually extended, beyond simply seeing his daughter married well and settled comfortably. Lucas Grant carried his own private reasons for wanting the alliance finalized as quickly as possible, reasons tied directly to trade agreements and territorial advantages that would benefit his family, regardless of how the marriage itself ultimately unfolded in the years to come. He had, in fact, played a far greater role in orchestrating the original circumstances that led Damien to choose Serafina than his own daughter had ever realized or suspected. Months before the public rejection in the Great Hall, Lucas had quietly worked to manufacture a sense of crisis within the pack's trade relations, one carefully designed to make an alliance with his own family appear urgently necessary, at precisely the moment it would benefit him most directly. He had subtly exaggerated tensions with the Eastern Territories, quietly influenced several key advisors within Damien's council, through carefully timed gifts and favors, and ensured that when the pressure to secure new alliances finally reached its peak, his daughter would be positioned as the obvious, unavoidable solution to a problem he himself had largely invented. Serafina knew some fragments of this larger scheme, though not nearly the full extent of it. She believed her father had simply capitalized cleverly on genuine circumstances, using his considerable influence to elevate her position at precisely the right moment. She did not know that the crisis itself had been almost entirely manufactured from the start, that the urgency Damien had felt so acutely when he chose to end his bond with Elena had been built on a foundation far less solid and far less honest than he had ever believed it to be. This deeper truth remained carefully buried for now, hidden beneath layers of subtle manipulation that had served Lucas Grant's private interests perfectly well up to this point. But truths, however carefully buried, have a persistent tendency to surface eventually, particularly when the people most affected by them begin asking the kinds of pointed questions that lead them steadily closer to answers no one ever intended for them to find. That slow, quiet process began, entirely without anyone's knowledge at first, with Nathan Hale, a young advisor within Damien's council, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable over recent weeks, with certain troubling discrepancies he noticed in the trade records used to justify the original urgency of the alliance months earlier. Nathan had been tasked, as part of the ongoing review of the Eastern Territory agreements tied to Elena's bloodline, with cross-referencing old trade documents against more recent, verified records. What he found troubled him deeply. Numbers that had originally been presented to the full council as clear evidence of an impending crisis did not match, in several important respects, the actual trade activity recorded in the pack's own careful ledgers from that same period. The shortages that had been described at the time as urgent and severe appeared, upon closer and more careful examination, to have been considerably less dire than the reports had originally suggested. Nathan brought his growing concerns first to a fellow advisor, a cautious and thoughtful woman who suggested he continue gathering solid evidence before raising the matter more broadly, given the obvious political sensitivity involved in any such accusation. Nathan agreed with her caution, and over the following days, he quietly expanded his careful research, uncovering additional inconsistencies that painted an increasingly troubling picture the more deeply he dug. Meanwhile, Damien remained largely unaware of the quiet, careful investigation slowly unfolding within his own council, his attention still consumed by the ongoing complications of the Eastern Territory negotiations, and by the growing, undeniable tension he felt each time he found himself once again in Elena's presence. The council sessions continued steadily, now stretching into their fourth full week, and each meeting seemed to peel back yet another layer of the careful distance Elena had initially worked so hard to maintain between them. She still addressed him formally in most contexts, still kept her tone carefully professional during their ongoing discussions of the historical agreements. But small moments of unguarded honesty had begun slipping through more frequently now. Moments where her genuine thoughts and feelings surfaced, despite every effort she made to keep them properly contained. Damien found himself treasuring these small moments more than he wanted to fully admit, storing them away carefully, like small treasures he could return to later, in the quiet, lonely hours when the weight of his chambers pressed in too heavily around him. One such moment occurred during a session focused on a particularly old and dense section of the agreements, thick with archaic language that required careful, patient interpretation from both of them. Elena had been working through a difficult passage with evident, mounting frustration, her brow furrowed as she tried to make proper sense of terminology that had fallen entirely out of common use generations earlier. "This section makes absolutely no sense," she muttered, more to herself than directly to him, pushing the document away with a small, frustrated huff that struck Damien as unexpectedly endearing, a rare, genuine crack in her usual carefully composed exterior. He leaned over to look more closely at the passage she had been struggling with, and without fully thinking through the gesture beforehand, found himself sitting closer to her than their sessions had previously required, close enough that he could catch the faint, familiar scent of her hair, close enough that the old, easy comfort they had once shared so naturally threatened to resurface, despite everything that had happened between them since. "I remember struggling with passages exactly like this one during my own training as a young alpha," he said, keeping his voice deliberately light, hoping to ease some of her mounting frustration. "My father used to say the old scholars wrote these agreements deliberately confusing, so that only the most patient minds could ever properly interpret them." Elena glanced at him then, a small, reluctant smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite her clear effort to resist it. "That sounds like something invented purely to comfort a frustrated student, rather than an actual historical fact anyone could verify." "Perhaps it was," Damien admitted, returning her small smile with one of his own. "But it worked well enough on me, back then." "Did it help, even a little, just now?" "A little," she conceded, and for one brief, unguarded moment, the old, easy familiarity between them flickered warmly back to life, achingly familiar, despite the walls both of them had worked so hard to carefully build since the night of the rejection. The moment did not last long. Elena seemed to catch herself almost immediately, straightening in her seat and deliberately putting careful distance back between them, her expression shifting swiftly back toward the professional composure she had maintained so consistently throughout every previous session. But Damien had seen the flicker clearly, had felt the genuine warmth of that brief, unguarded exchange, and it lingered with him long after their session had officially ended for the day. He began to understand, with growing and undeniable clarity, that the feelings he still carried for Elena had not simply faded away the moment he ended their bond before the entire pack. If anything, the weeks of forced but frequent proximity had only deepened his painful awareness of everything he had so carelessly given up, everything he had allowed political pressure and manufactured false urgency to convince him was absolutely necessary to release. That evening, as he sat alone in his chambers turning these uncomfortable realizations over carefully in his mind, Nathan Hale requested an urgent private audience, explaining through a messenger that he had uncovered information regarding the trade records tied to the original alliance decision that required Damien's immediate attention. Damien agreed to see him without hesitation, though he had no idea, as he settled into his chair to hear whatever Nathan had discovered, just how significantly this particular conversation would shift everything he currently believed about the choice he had made months earlier. Nathan laid out his careful findings methodically, presenting the growing list of discrepancies between the reports originally used to justify the alliance and the actual trade records recovered from that same period. He explained his concerns cautiously, careful not to make any direct accusations without sufficient supporting evidence, but the implication behind his findings was clear enough that Damien understood immediately what Nathan was gently suggesting, even before the young advisor stated it outright in plain terms. "You believe the crisis was exaggerated," Damien said slowly, his voice carefully controlled, despite the growing unease steadily building in his chest as he spoke the words aloud, perhaps even deliberately manufactured. "I cannot say for certain who exactly was responsible," Nathan said carefully, choosing his words with obvious caution, "but the numbers simply do not support the severity of the situation as it was originally presented to the full council at the time. I felt you needed to know this, given how significant a decision was ultimately made, based on that information." Damien sat in silence for a long moment, after Nathan finally left his chambers, the full weight of this troubling new information settling over him slowly, like a heavy fog rolling steadily in from some unseen distance. If the crisis had truly been exaggerated, if the urgency behind the alliance with Serafina's family had been carefully manufactured, rather than genuinely necessary, then the entire foundation of his decision to end his bond with Elena had been built on premises that were fundamentally false from the very beginning. He thought of Serafina's confident, satisfied smile on the night of the announcement, of her father's persistent, mounting pressure for an early wedding, of the timeline that had felt increasingly urgent despite his own quiet instincts repeatedly telling him something did not properly add up. Pieces began slowly arranging themselves in his mind, forming a troubling picture he did not particularly want to see clearly, but could no longer reasonably continue to ignore. He understood he would need considerably more than Nathan's initial findings before he could act decisively on these growing suspicions. Accusations of this magnitude, directed at a family as genuinely influential as Serafina's, would require solid, undeniable proof, not merely troubling inconsistencies buried within old trade records. But the seed of doubt that had first been steadily growing within him since Elena's silent, dignified walk from the great hall had just been given entirely new, remarkably fertile ground in which to take root even more deeply than before. He resolved, sitting there alone that night, to pursue the full truth carefully and thoroughly, regardless of wherever it ultimately led him, and regardless of what it might eventually mean for the alliance he had already publicly committed himself to, before the entire watching pack. Whatever the final outcome turned out to be, he understood clearly that he owed it to Elena, and equally to himself, to fully understand what had truly happened, before allowing the wedding to proceed any further, down a path built on foundations he could no longer fully trust. He spent the following days moving with unusual caution, careful not to reveal the growing scope of his suspicions to anyone beyond Nathan, and the one trusted advisor Nathan had already confided in. He avoided any obvious change in his outward behavior around Serafina, continuing to attend the wedding planning sessions her family organized with the same measured, careful attention he had shown from the very beginning, even as his private thoughts churned steadily beneath that carefully maintained surface. He found himself, more than once during those difficult days, wanting desperately to speak with Elena directly about what he had learned, to share the growing weight of this troubling discovery with the one person whose steady presence had first helped him recognize how deeply something had gone wrong. But he held himself back each time, unwilling to burden her with unproven suspicions, before he had gathered sufficient evidence to properly justify the accusation, unwilling to offer her false hope built on foundations that might yet crumble under closer scrutiny. Instead, he channeled his growing unease into quiet, careful diligence, reviewing every document Nathan brought to him with the same patient thoroughness Elena herself had shown throughout their many council sessions together, as though some part of him hoped that honoring her example might help him find his way more surely toward the full truth he now felt genuinely determined to uncover, whatever the ultimate cost turned out to be. Serafina, watching him carefully during those same days, noticed the shift in his manner, even without understanding its true cause. He seemed more withdrawn than usual during their wedding planning sessions, offering only brief, distracted responses to questions about flowers and seating arrangements and the guest lists her family continued expanding with each passing week. She attributed this distance, at first, to the ordinary stress of pack leadership, but a small, persistent doubt continued nagging at her regardless. A doubt she found herself unable to fully silence, no matter how many reassuring explanations she offered herself in its place. She began, quietly, watching Nathan Hale as well, noticing the young advisor's frequent private meetings with Damien, the way he carried stacks of old records back and forth between the archive room and the Alpha's chambers, with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to routine council business. She said nothing of these observations to her father, uncertain what they meant, and unwilling to raise an alarm that might prove entirely unfounded, but she filed the details away carefully nonetheless, the same instinct for gathering useful information that had served her well throughout her life, quietly at work beneath her composed exterior. Elena, meanwhile, remained entirely unaware of the investigation slowly unfolding around her, focused instead on her own steady progress through the remaining council sessions, and on the increasingly complicated question of what she truly wanted from the future stretching out ahead of her. She continued meeting with Clara regularly, continued fielding occasional whispers from pack members who had not yet let go of the story surrounding her rejection, and continued, in quiet private moments, turning over the small, unexpected warmth she had felt during the season's gathering, unsure what to make of it or where it might eventually lead her. Damien spent the following days moving carefully, aware that any obvious change in his behavior might alert Serafina or her father to the investigation, quietly unfolding beneath the surface of everyday pack business. He assigned Nathan Hale to continue gathering evidence discreetly, expanding the scope of his careful research to include not only the trade records, but also correspondence exchanged between council advisors during the months leading up to the original alliance decision. Nathan worked with careful, methodical precision, cross-referencing letters, meeting notes, and financial records, slowly building a timeline that grew more troubling with each new document he managed to uncover. He discovered that several advisors who had spoken most forcefully in favor of the alliance during those original council sessions had received unusually generous trade concessions from Lucas Grant's family in the months immediately following those very discussions. The pattern was subtle, carefully obscured beneath layers of legitimate-seeming transactions, but once Nathan began deliberately looking for it, the connections became increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Damien reviewed each new finding with a mixture of anger and genuine disbelief. He had trusted his counsel completely, had relied on their careful counsel during one of the most difficult decisions of his entire leadership, and the growing evidence now suggested that this trust had been deliberately exploited in service of another family's ambitions. He thought often, during those long, difficult days, of the moment he had stood before the entire pack and ended his bond with Elena, believing sincerely that he was making a necessary sacrifice for the good of his people. The mounting possibility that this sacrifice had been carefully engineered rather than genuinely required sat like a heavy stone lodged permanently in his chest, weighty and unrelenting no matter how he tried to set it aside. He did not share his growing suspicions with Serafina, uncertain how deeply she herself might be involved in her father's schemes, and unwilling to alert Lucas Grant to the ongoing investigation before he had gathered sufficient proof to move forward safely. Their interactions during this period grew increasingly strained as a result, though Serafina attributed his obvious distance to the ongoing stress of pack leadership, rather than suspecting the true, more troubling reason behind his withdrawal from her. Meanwhile, the council sessions with Elena continued steadily, now focused on finally finalizing the resolution of the historical bloodline agreements that had kept her tied to the pack lands for weeks longer than either of them had initially anticipated when the process first began. The complications, once fully untangled through careful, patient work, proved considerably less severe than originally feared, requiring only a formal transfer of certain territorial rights, rather than the extensive renegotiation the elders had initially warned might prove necessary. Elena felt a strange, complicated mixture of relief and reluctance as the sessions drew steadily toward their eventual conclusion. She had wanted, for weeks now, to finally be free of the obligations tying her firmly to the packlands, free to pursue the fresh start she had originally planned before any of this complicated situation had ever begun. But the prospect of actually leaving now, with the resolution finally drawing within reach, brought with it an unexpected hesitation she had not anticipated feeling when she first requested her formal release from the council. She found herself, during quiet moments, alone in her small house, thinking often of the conversation she had shared with Damien weeks earlier, of the brief flicker of warmth that had passed between them during their session over the confusing archaic passage. She told herself these small moments meant nothing significant, that old habits and old affections did not simply disappear entirely because logic told her they should have. But the honesty she demanded of herself during quiet, private moments made it increasingly difficult to fully dismiss what she had genuinely felt in that instant. Clara noticed the shift in her friend's demeanor during their regular visits together. The way Elena's careful planning for departure had grown noticeably less enthusiastic, more hesitant, over the past several weeks. She raised the observation gently one evening, careful not to push too hard or too quickly. "You've stopped talking about the new town," Clara said. "The one near the coast, you were so genuinely excited about, only a month ago." Elena considered this observation, surprised to realize Clara was entirely right. "I suppose I have stopped mentioning it. I don't fully know why, exactly. Maybe I've simply been distracted lately by everything happening with the council sessions. Or maybe," Clara said carefully, choosing her words with obvious care, Some part of you isn't quite as certain about leaving as you were before all of this began." Elena did not have a ready answer prepared for that gentle observation, and the silence that followed told Clara everything she truly needed to know, regardless of whatever Elena might eventually have chosen to say in response. Elena herself sat with the discomfort of that particular silence for a long while after Clara finally left that evening, turning over feelings she had tried carefully to keep contained since the council sessions with Damien had first begun weeks earlier. She had told herself, from the very beginning of all of this, that she would not allow his choice to define her, that she had built her own sense of worth and self entirely apart from whether he genuinely wanted her by his side or not. That much remained absolutely true. She had not softened toward him out of any real need for his validation or approval. But somewhere within the quiet, unguarded moments of the past several weeks, she had begun to see genuine glimpses of the man she had once truly loved. Glimpses that made it increasingly harder to hold on to the careful anger and hurt that had protected her so consistently since the night of the rejection itself. She did not yet know what to do with these complicated, resurfacing feelings, and she was not entirely certain she truly wanted to know just yet. For now, she focused instead on the practical matter directly at hand, the final resolution of the ongoing council sessions, and pushed the more complicated questions about her uncertain future carefully to the side, to be properly addressed once the immediate business had finally concluded between them. The final council session took place on a bright, unusually clear afternoon, nearly 6 full weeks after the entire process had first begun between them. Elena arrived to find Damien already seated at the long table, a stack of finalized documents spread neatly before him. The elder mediator, absent for what the council had assured them both, would be a brief, straightforward closing meeting, requiring only their final signatures to complete. "This should be the very last of it," Damien said, sliding the final document carefully across the table toward her. "Once you sign, the bloodline obligations will be formally and fully transferred, and you'll be entirely free to leave whenever you personally choose to go." Elena took the document from him, scanning through the now familiar language one final time before reaching for the pen, resting quietly beside it. She paused before signing, her hand hovering uncertainly over the page, and Damien watched her closely with an intensity he made no real effort to hide, waiting anxiously to see whether she would follow through with the signature that would formally sever this final remaining tie between them. "Is something wrong?" he asked quietly, his voice careful. "No," Elena said, though her voice carried a hesitation that seemed to contradict her own words. "I just find myself genuinely surprised that I've finally reached this exact point. I spent weeks wanting this precise moment more than almost anything else, and now that it's actually here in front of me, I don't feel quite the relief I originally expected to feel." Damien's chest tightened noticeably at her honest words, hope and uncertainty warring within him in nearly equal measure. "What do you feel instead, then?" Elena looked up at him then, her expression more genuinely open than he had seen it since long before the night of the rejection itself. "I don't entirely know, if I'm being completely honest with you. Uncertain, I suppose, about a great many things I once believed were already settled." He wanted, in that particular moment, to tell her everything he had learned from Nathan's careful investigation, to explain plainly that the crisis which had driven him to end their bond might have been entirely manufactured, engineered deliberately, by a family determined to secure their own advantage, regardless of the genuine cost to others involved. But he did not yet have sufficient proof to make such a serious accusation, and raising the possibility now, without solid evidence to support it, felt genuinely reckless, potentially damaging to Elena in ways he could not fully predict or control at this stage. Instead, he simply held her gaze for a long, quiet moment, allowing the silence between them to carry a weight that words alone might have cheapened considerably. "For what it's worth," he said finally, "I've found myself genuinely uncertain about a great many things too, these past several weeks." Elena did not respond immediately to that, her pen still resting quietly against the surface of the document in front of her, still unsigned. She studied his face carefully for a long moment, searching for something she could not quite name even to herself, before finally lowering her gaze back down to the paper and signing her name with a steady, deliberate hand that betrayed none of the uncertainty she had just openly admitted to feeling. "There," she said quietly, sliding the now signed document back across the table toward him. "It's officially done. Damien accepted the signed paper carefully, though the finality of the small gesture felt far heavier to him than the simple administrative task it technically represented. He understood, with growing certainty, that he could not simply let this be the true end between them. Not now. Not when he understood so much more clearly how much of what had brought them to this exact point had been built on foundations he no longer fully trusted. "Elena," he said, before she could rise from her seat and leave, "I need more time to properly explain some things to you. Things I've only recently begun to fully understand myself. Would you be willing to meet with me again, outside of these strictly formal sessions? Not as alpha and former mate, but simply as two people who genuinely deserve an honest conversation with one another." Elena studied him for a long, careful moment, weighing his unexpected request thoroughly. Part of her wanted to decline outright, to walk away now that her formal obligations had finally been fully resolved, to begin the new life she had carefully planned for weeks, without complicating it any further, with unresolved feelings toward a man who had already made his choice once before, publicly and painfully. But another part of her, the part that had genuinely noticed the honest uncertainty in his voice, the part that remembered clearly the warmth of easier days before politics and alliances had ever come between them, found herself curious despite everything about what he actually wanted to explain. "One conversation," she said finally, her voice steady, "but I make no promises whatsoever, beyond simply listening to what you have to say to me." Damien nodded, visible relief evident in the slight easing of tension across his shoulders. "That's all I'm genuinely asking for." "Thank you, Elena, for agreeing to hear me out." She left the council chamber that afternoon, with the formal obligations of her bloodline, finally and completely resolved, free, for the very first time in weeks, to leave the Packlands whenever she personally chose to go. But instead of feeling the relief she had originally expected to feel so strongly, she found herself thinking instead, with a complicated mixture of hope and lingering caution, about the conversation Damien had specifically asked for, and about what particular truths he might have to share that could once again reshape everything she currently believed about the choice that had originally brought her to this exact point in her life. That night, unable to settle into sleep, Elena found her thoughts drifting backward, unbidden, to the early days of her bond with Damien, long before councils and alliances and manufactured crises had ever come between them. She remembered the first time he had sought her out deliberately, not out of any particular obligation, but simply because he wanted her company, after a long, difficult day spent settling a dispute between two feuding families along the northern boundary. He had found her near the old well, sat down beside her without a word, and simply existed quietly in her company, for nearly an hour, before either of them spoke. She remembered, too, the way he used to bring her small, unremarkable things during that first year. A particular kind of wildflower that grew only near the eastern ridge, a smooth stone from the riverbed that had caught his eye for no reason he could ever properly explain. None of it had been grand or especially memorable on its own, but the accumulation of those small gestures had built, slowly and steadily, into a trust she had rarely felt with anyone else in her life, a sense that she mattered to him, not for what she could offer the pack, but simply for who she was. She wondered, lying awake in the darkness, exactly when that steady accumulation of small gestures had begun to fade, replaced gradually by the pressures of leadership and the demands of a growing pack that required more and more of his time and attention with each passing year. She did not blame him entirely for that shift, understanding as she did the genuine weight of what leadership required of a man in his position. But she could not help wondering, either, whether some part of what had happened between them, the growing distance that had made his choice of Serafina feel almost inevitable by the time it finally arrived, might have been prevented if either of them had fought harder to protect those small, quiet moments from the pressures steadily crowding them out. She rose the next morning with these thoughts still lingering, and found herself, almost without deciding to, walking toward the village market earlier than she typically did, needing the ordinary bustle of daily life to settle her unsettled mind. Clara joined her partway through the morning, having spotted her from a distance, and the two of them fell into step together, weaving between stalls selling fresh vegetables and warm bread and carefully mended clothing. "You look like you didn't sleep," Clara observed, studying her friend's face carefully. "I didn't, not really," Elena admitted. "I kept thinking about the early days, before everything became so complicated." "Good thoughts or difficult ones?" Clara asked. Both, I think, Elena said. Mostly good, actually, which surprised me. I expected thinking about those days to hurt more than it did. Clara considered this as they continued walking. Maybe that's a sign of something. That the good memories don't hurt the way they once did, I mean. Elena turned the observation over carefully as they walked past a stall selling dried herbs, the familiar scent momentarily transporting her further back into memory, to afternoons spent gathering similar herbs alongside her mother, long before any of this complicated history had ever begun. Or maybe I've simply had enough time now to separate the good from the bad, instead of letting the ending overshadow everything that came before it. They paused near a stall selling warm pastries, and Clara purchased two, handing one to Elena with the easy familiarity of a friendship built across many years. Whatever you decide about Damien's request for another conversation, Clara said, I trust you to make the right choice for yourself. You've earned that trust, this past year more than ever. Elena smiled at that, genuinely grateful for her friend's steady, unwavering support through everything that had happened. Thank you. I don't know yet what the right choice actually is, but I appreciate you trusting me to find it, even when I'm still uncertain myself. They continued through the market for a while longer, the ordinary rhythm of the morning gradually easing some of the restless uncertainty that had kept Elena awake through much of the previous night. By the time she returned to her small house in the early afternoon, she felt steadier than she had in days, ready, at last, to face whatever conversation Damien intended to have with her, whenever he chose to request it. Across the territory, Nathan Hale continued his careful work throughout that same week, uncovering additional evidence that only deepened the troubling picture, already forming around Lucas Grant's involvement in the original alliance decision. He discovered, buried within a set of older shipping manifests, clear evidence that a shipment of grain reported as lost to raiders along the eastern border had, in fact, been quietly redirected to one of Lucas Grant's own private storehouses, the loss itself entirely fabricated to support the narrative of crisis that had driven the council toward urgent action months earlier. Nathan brought this new finding directly to Damien, laying it out carefully, alongside everything else he had already gathered. Damien studied the manifest for a long time in silence, feeling something harden steadily within him, as the full scope of the manipulation became increasingly, undeniably clear. This is enough, he said finally, setting the document down carefully on the table between them. Combined with everything else you've found, this is enough to bring before the full council. I want you to prepare everything properly, in order, ready to present clearly, and without room for doubt. It will take a few more days to organize everything as thoroughly as it deserves, Nathan said. I want to make certain nothing can be easily dismissed or explained away, once we bring it forward. Take the time you need, Damien said. But not much longer than that. I've delayed long enough already, and every day this remains hidden is another day built on a foundation I no longer trust. Nathan nodded, understanding the weight behind his alpha's words, and departed to continue his careful preparations. Damien remained alone in his chambers for a long while afterward, turning over everything he now knew, and thinking, as he so often did during these quiet hours, of the conversation he still needed to have with Elena, a conversation that would finally require him to share the full truth of what he had discovered, regardless of how deeply it might complicate everything that remained unresolved between them. Serafina, meanwhile, had grown restless with the continued delays surrounding the wedding timeline, and she took it upon herself to request a private meeting with Damien to address the matter directly, rather than continuing to wait for him to raise it on his own. She arrived at his chambers that evening dressed carefully, her manner composed but carrying an edge of determination she made little effort to soften. We need to speak plainly about the wedding, she said, once the customary greetings had passed between them. It has now been delayed twice, and my father grows increasingly impatient with the lack of a firm date. I would like to understand exactly what is causing this hesitation, Damien, if hesitation is truly what this is. Damien considered his response carefully, aware that he could not yet reveal the full truth of what Nathan had uncovered, without risking the investigation itself, but equally aware that continuing to offer vague, deflecting answers would only deepen Serafina's justified suspicion. There are matters within the council that require careful attention before I can commit fully to a firm date, he said finally. Matters I am not yet in a position to discuss openly, even with you. Serafina studied him closely, searching his face for something she could not quite name. Does this have anything to do with Elena Hart? The direct question caught him slightly off guard, though he kept his expression carefully controlled. It has to do with council matters that predate even my bond with Elena, he said, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true, even if it did not fully answer the deeper question she was truly asking. That isn't really an answer, Serafina said, her voice quieter now, less demanding and more genuinely searching. I've noticed the way your attention drifts, Damien. I'm not foolish enough to pretend I haven't. I would simply like to know where I actually stand, rather than continuing to wait in uncertainty, while you sort through whatever it is you're sorting through. Damien felt the weight of her honest question settle over him, recognizing that she deserved more clarity than he had been offering her, even if the full truth remained impossible to share just yet. I owe you an honest answer, and I intend to give you one, fully, very soon, he said. But I need a little more time before I can do that properly. I promise you, Serafina, you will not be left waiting in uncertainty much longer. She did not seem entirely satisfied by his response, but she accepted it nonetheless, recognizing perhaps that pressing further would yield nothing more useful in the moment. She left his chambers that evening with the same restless unease she had carried in, though now accompanied by a clearer sense that something significant was being carefully withheld from her, something she suspected she would not welcome once it finally came to light. Damien watched her go with a heavy heart, understanding fully that the reckoning he had promised her was drawing closer with each passing day, and that whatever remained of the careful arrangement between them would not survive the truth Nathan was preparing to bring before the full council. They met 3 days later, at Damien's request, in a quiet clearing near the edge of the pack territory, rather than within the formal walls of the Great Hall or the council chambers. He had chosen the location deliberately, wanting to speak with Elena somewhere entirely free of the weight and history carried by those official spaces, somewhere they could simply be two people having an honest conversation, without titles or obligations pressing in from every direction around them. Elena arrived to find him already waiting, standing quietly beneath the wide branches of an old oak tree that had marked the boundary of the territory for as long as either of them could remember from childhood. He looked less composed than she had seen him in weeks, his usual careful control replaced by something more restless, more openly uncertain than she was accustomed to seeing from him. "Thank you for coming," he said, as she approached slowly across the clearing. "You said you had something to explain," Elena replied, keeping her tone carefully measured, though genuine curiosity had been steadily building within her since their last conversation days earlier. "I'm listening." Damien took a slow breath, gathering himself properly before beginning. He explained, carefully and thoroughly, everything Nathan Hale had uncovered over the past several weeks. He described the discrepancies in the trade records, the exaggerated reports of crisis that had driven the council toward urgent, hasty action, the pattern of generous concessions granted to advisors whose support had proven most valuable in pushing the alliance forward. He laid out the evidence as plainly and as clearly as he possibly could, watching Elena's face carefully throughout, as understanding slowly dawned across her features. "You're saying the crisis that led you to end our bond may have been entirely manufactured," Elena said slowly, once he had finally finished. "Deliberately, by Serafina's own family." "I cannot yet prove Serafina herself was aware of her father's actions," Damien said carefully, "but the evidence pointing toward Lucas Grant's involvement grows steadily stronger with each new document Nathan manages to uncover. I believe, with real confidence now, that the urgency I felt so strongly that night, the pressure that convinced me ending our bond was truly necessary for the pack's survival, was built on a foundation that never genuinely existed in the first place." Elena absorbed this information slowly, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions rise sharply within her. There was, first, a sharp flash of genuine anger at the sudden realization that the pain she had endured, the public humiliation, the long weeks of forcing herself to remain composed while her entire life was upended around her, might have been the direct result of deliberate manipulation rather than any genuine necessity at all. But beneath that anger, she found something else waiting there too, something quieter and considerably more difficult to fully name. "Even if the crisis was manufactured," she said carefully, weighing each word, "you still made the choice to end our bond. You still stood before the entire pack and released me without warning. without giving me any chance to properly understand or respond, before it was already done. That particular choice was yours alone, Damien, regardless of whatever information you happened to be given at the time. I know, Damien said, and the honesty in his voice struck her as genuinely sincere, entirely free of the careful diplomatic language he might have once used to soften such an admission. I'm not trying to excuse what I did. By placing all the blame on manipulation, I simply failed to recognize at the time. I made the choice myself. I take full responsibility for the pain that choice caused you, regardless of anything else. I'm telling you this now because you deserve to know the full truth, not because I expect it to somehow undo the harm that has already been done. Elena studied him for a long moment, weighing his careful words against the memory of that painful night, against the weeks of quiet grief she had carried silently ever since. Why are you telling me this now, rather than simply keeping it entirely to yourself and moving forward with the wedding as originally planned? Damien met her gaze steadily, without flinching. Because I cannot marry Serafina, knowing the foundation of that decision was built entirely on lies, regardless of whether she herself was personally involved in her father's schemes or not. And because you deserve to know the truth about what actually happened, even if it changes nothing whatsoever about how you currently feel toward me. What do you intend to do with this information? Elena asked, her voice steady. I intend to bring it before the full council, once Nathan has gathered sufficient proof to properly withstand any scrutiny, Damien said. I will not marry into an alliance built on manufactured crisis and manipulated advisors, whatever the political cost turns out to be. Whatever happens between us after that, Elena, I owe it to the pack, and equally to you, to make certain the full truth finally comes to light. Elena remained quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had just shared with her. She felt, beneath the anger and the complicated tangle of old affection and fresh uncertainty, a strange, unexpected sense of vindication settling within her. She had never truly believed, even in her darkest moments following the rejection, that Damien's choice had been made entirely out of genuine indifference toward her. Something about the manner of the rejection, the timing of it all, the sudden and forceful pressure toward marriage with Serafina had never quite added up properly in her mind, though she had always lacked the concrete evidence to understand exactly why. I appreciate you telling me this, she said finally. It doesn't erase what happened between us. It doesn't undo the weeks I spent carefully rebuilding my life around the assumption that our bond was truly, permanently over. But I understand why you felt I deserved to know the truth. That's all I genuinely hoped for, Damien said quietly. I don't expect anything from you because of this, Elena. I'm not telling you this in order to win you back, or to pressure you into forgiving me. I simply couldn't continue moving forward, with the wedding, with everything else, while keeping this particular truth carefully hidden from you. Elena appreciated the careful distinction he drew, the clear fact that he was not using this significant revelation as leverage to pressure her back into a relationship she had spent weeks working diligently to move beyond. It made his honesty feel considerably more genuine to her, less like another calculated political maneuver, and more like the honest reckoning he claimed it truly to be. What will happen to Serafina's family once this comes before the full council? Elena asked, curious despite herself about the broader consequences of what Damien had discovered through Nathan's careful investigation. That depends entirely on the full extent of what Nathan ultimately uncovers, Damien said. If Lucas Grant deliberately manufactured a crisis in order to manipulate pact decisions for his own family's advantage, the consequences will likely prove severe. Trade privileges revoked, formal censure from the council, possibly considerably worse, depending on how far his manipulation truly extended. As for Serafina herself, much depends on whether she was genuinely unaware of her father's actions, or whether she knowingly benefited from his schemes. Elena considered this carefully, feeling an unexpected flicker of something close to genuine sympathy for Serafina, despite everything that had happened between them. It must be terribly difficult, discovering that your own father built your entire engagement on manipulation and lies, if she truly didn't know anything about it. It will prove difficult regardless of what she knew, Damien agreed. But I cannot allow that difficulty to prevent the truth from finally coming to light. Too much has already been built on false foundations. The pact deserves leadership, grounded firmly in honesty, not convenient fictions, manufactured entirely for one family's private advantage. They talked for a while longer beneath the old oak tree, the conversation gradually shifting away from the heavy weight of Nathan's findings toward quieter, more genuinely personal territory. Damien asked about her plans, now that the bloodline obligations had been formally and fully resolved, and Elena found herself answering honestly, describing the coastal town she had once been so excited about, and the growing uncertainty that had crept steadily into those plans over recent weeks. "I don't know anymore, if I'm being completely honest with you," she admitted. "Part of me still wants that fresh start, that chance to build something entirely my own, far away from all the history and complication tied so deeply to this place. But another part of me isn't nearly as certain as I was even a month ago." Damien did not push her further on what exactly had caused that particular uncertainty, though the hopeful expression that crossed his face briefly suggested he understood, or at least sincerely hoped he understood, what she was carefully avoiding stating outright to him. "Whatever you eventually decide," he said, "I want you to know it will be entirely your own choice to make. I won't pressure you, Elena, not after everything you've already endured, because of choices made without your input or consent." "Thank you," Elena said, and meant it genuinely, appreciating the restraint he showed, the deliberate effort not to use this particular moment of vulnerability as an opportunity to press his own case for reconciliation between them. They parted ways as the afternoon light began softening gradually into evening, Elena returning to her small house, with far more to carefully consider than she had carried with her that morning. Damien, returning to his own chambers, with a renewed sense of purpose regarding the investigation that would soon need to be brought before the full council, regardless of the personal and political upheaval it would inevitably cause for everyone involved. Neither of them spoke, during that particular conversation, about what might come next between them, about whether the old bond that had once connected them so deeply could ever truly be rebuilt after everything that had happened. But something had genuinely shifted between them nonetheless, a foundation of real honesty, steadily replacing the careful formality that had defined their interactions since the night of the rejection, and both of them understood, even without stating it directly aloud, that this shift marked the beginning of something neither of them could yet fully name or fully understand. That evening, Elena found herself sitting once more with Clara, recounting the full conversation beneath the old oak tree with a thoroughness she had not offered for any of their previous discussions. Clara listened with quiet, careful attention, occasionally asking a clarifying question but mostly simply letting Elena work through everything aloud, the way she so often needed to when processing something significant. "Do you believe him?" Clara asked, once Elena had finished describing everything Damien had shared with her. "I believe the evidence, from what he described," Elena said slowly. "Nathan Hale has always struck me as careful and honest. Not the sort of person who would raise an alarm like this without solid ground beneath it. And Damien didn't need to tell me any of this. He could have simply let the wedding proceed and kept the truth buried, if he'd truly wanted to avoid the complication." "That's true," Clara agreed, "though I imagine part of him also wanted you to know, for reasons that go beyond simple honesty." Elena considered this, a faint, rueful smile touching her mouth. "You're not wrong. I could see it in his face, the hope that this might change something between us. He didn't say it outright, but it was there." "How did that make you feel?" Clara asked gently. "Complicated," Elena admitted. "I don't want to be won back through pity, or through the relief of learning the crisis wasn't entirely genuine. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. But I also can't pretend the truth doesn't matter. It does. It changes how I understand everything that happened, even if it doesn't undo any of it." Clara nodded slowly, understanding the careful distinction her friend was drawing. "What will you do now, with all of this?" "Wait, I think," Elena said. "Wait to see what happens when this comes before the council. Wait to see whether Damien follows through on what he's told me, or whether the pressure of politics finds some way to bury it again, before it can matter." She paused, staring into the fire for a long moment. "And wait to see what I actually feel, once the dust from all of this finally settles." Clara reached over and squeezed her hand. "That sounds like a wise plan. You don't have to decide everything tonight." Elena appreciated the reminder more than she let on, grateful, as she so often was, for a friend who understood the value of patience, even when patience felt difficult to hold on to. They talked for a while longer about lighter matters, the upcoming winter, a bolt of fine wool fabric Clara had spotted at the market that morning, allowing the heavier conversation to settle gradually into the background without disappearing entirely. Across the Packlands, Damien spent that same evening reviewing, once more, every document Nathan had gathered, searching for any weakness in the case that a skilled defender might exploit before the full council. He found himself, more than once, setting the documents aside to simply sit with the memory of Elena's face beneath the old oak tree, the careful, guarded hope he had seen flicker briefly across her features, before she caught herself and drew back into caution once again. He understood he had no right to expect anything from her yet, no right to assume that sharing the truth automatically earned him a path back to what they had once shared, but he allowed himself, in the privacy of his own chambers, to hold on to a small, careful thread of hope nonetheless, the same kind of hope Elena herself had once refused to show the entire pack on the night of her rejection. He wondered, turning the thought over slowly, whether hope itself might be its own quiet form of strength, the same kind of strength she had taught him to recognize in her, if he was patient enough, and honest enough, to earn the chance to prove it. He rose early the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and made his way to the archive room, where Nathan had already begun his day's work, surrounded by neat stacks of carefully organized documents. The young advisor looked up as Damien entered, offering a brief nod of greeting, before returning his attention to the ledger spread open before him. "How close are we to being ready?" Damien asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Closer than I expected to be by now," Nathan said. "I found 2 more instances yesterday evening of concessions granted shortly after key votes. Combined with the shipping manifest, I believe we have more than enough to bring before the council without fear of the evidence being easily dismissed." "Good," Damien said, though the word carried more weight than simple approval. "I want this handled properly, Nathan. Thoroughly, and without room for doubt. Too much depends on getting this right the first time." "I understand," Nathan said. "I'll have everything organized within 2 days, ready for formal presentation." Damien thanked him, and remained a while longer, helping where he could, grateful for the quiet, focused work that gave his restless mind something productive to hold on to, besides the uncertain waiting that stretched ahead of him. He thought, as he worked alongside Nathan through the early hours of the morning, that this too was its own kind of patience, the steady, unglamorous labor of building a case strong enough to finally set things right, regardless of how long it took to complete properly. Nathan Hale spent the following 2 weeks working with quiet, relentless focus, gathering every possible piece of evidence he could find to build an airtight case regarding Lucas Grant's manipulation of the original alliance decision. He interviewed advisors carefully, framing his questions in ways that revealed useful information without alerting anyone to the true purpose behind his careful inquiries. He cross-referenced financial records from 3 separate seasons, tracing the pattern of concessions granted to key council voices in the weeks immediately following their public support for the alliance with Serafina's family. The picture that steadily emerged was damning in its clarity. Lucas Grant had not simply capitalized on genuine circumstances, as Serafina herself sincerely believed. He had actively fabricated reports of trade shortages, paid select messengers to deliver deliberately false information about tensions along the eastern border, and quietly rewarded council members whose support proved most valuable in pushing the alliance forward through the full council. The scale of the manipulation extended far beyond what Damien had initially suspected, revealing a coordinated effort that had spanned many months, carefully timed to create exactly the crisis atmosphere needed to make Serafina's family appear as the only viable, responsible solution available to the pack. Damien reviewed Nathan's final, comprehensive report with a controlled fury that took considerable effort to properly contain. He thought of the night in the Great Hall, of the words he had spoken believing them to be genuinely necessary, of Elena's silent, dignified composure as she absorbed a rejection built entirely on a foundation of careful lies. The weight of that stark realization settled over him with crushing clarity, and he understood, without any remaining doubt, that he could no longer delay bringing this evidence before the full council, regardless of the personal and political consequences that would inevitably follow such a public reckoning. He called for an emergency council session, requesting the presence of every elder and senior advisor within the pack without exception. He did not explain the specific purpose of the meeting in advance, wanting to present the evidence directly and without warning, before anyone had the chance to prepare a defense or attempt to quietly bury the truth once again, before it could be properly heard. The hall was thick with tension as the council slowly gathered, elders exchanging uncertain glances, whispering speculation about the sudden and unexplained urgency of the summons that had interrupted their normal schedules. Serafina arrived alongside her father, both of them settling into seats near the front of the hall, entirely unaware of what was about to unfold before them. Damien stood before the assembled council, Nathan beside him holding the carefully organized evidence they had spent weeks compiling with such painstaking care. He began speaking without any preamble, his voice steady and controlled despite the enormous weight of what he was about to reveal to everyone gathered. Months ago, this council made a decision that reshaped the entire future of this pack, he said. We were told that a crisis in our Eastern trade relations demanded urgent, immediate action, that an alliance with the Grant family was not simply advantageous, but genuinely necessary for our continued survival. That decision led directly to the ending of my bond with Elena Hart, a choice I made believing sincerely that it served the greater good of this entire pack. Murmurs rippled steadily through the hall, elders shifting uncomfortably in their seats, though none yet fully understood where this speech was ultimately leading them. Serafina's expression had shifted swiftly from curiosity to genuine unease, her eyes darting anxiously toward her father, who remained carefully composed despite the mounting tension building steadily throughout the room. I have recently learned, Damien continued, his voice unwavering, that the crisis which drove that particular decision was manufactured, deliberately fabricated by Lucas Grant, in order to secure an alliance that would benefit his own family's private interests, regardless of the genuine cost to this pack, or to the people whose lives were upended by decisions made based entirely on false information. The hall erupted into a wave of shocked whispers, several elders rising abruptly from their seats in outrage, demanding proper explanation and solid proof in equal measure. Damien raised a hand, calling firmly for silence, and Nathan stepped forward to present the evidence they had carefully gathered, laying out the falsified reports, the pattern of financial concessions, the meticulous timeline that revealed months of deliberate, calculated manipulation. Lucas Grant rose slowly from his seat, his usual composure finally cracking for the first time, as the full weight of the evidence against him became unmistakably clear to everyone gathered in the hall. This is a gross misrepresentation, he said, his voice carrying considerably less conviction than his chosen words intended to convey. Trade fluctuations occur naturally, as anyone experienced in commerce well understands. These records could easily reflect any number of legitimate circumstances. The concessions granted to council advisors who spoke most forcefully in favor of this alliance tell a rather different story, Damien said, his voice hard and entirely unyielding. As does the precise timing of the false reports regarding eastern border tensions, which conveniently arrived at exactly the moment this council was weighing its most significant political decision in recent years. Serafina sat frozen in her seat throughout the entire exchange, her face pale, her eyes wide with a shock that appeared, to everyone watching closely, entirely genuine and unrehearsed. She turned toward her father, her voice barely above a trembling whisper, though it carried clearly through the now nearly silent hall. Father, is any of this actually true? Lucas Grant did not answer his own daughter directly, his prolonged silence speaking considerably louder than any denial could have managed. Serafina's expression shifted rapidly from shock to something bordering on genuine horror, as full understanding settled heavily over her. The devastating realization that her engagement, her entire position, everything she had believed she had rightfully earned and won, had been built from the very beginning on a foundation of manipulation she had known absolutely nothing about. The council session that followed stretched long into the evening hours, elders debating carefully the appropriate consequences for Lucas Grant's calculated actions, for the advisors who had knowingly accepted concessions in direct exchange for their support, and for the broader implications this shocking revelation carried for the pack's leadership and existing alliances. Damien remained firm throughout the lengthy discussion, insisting steadily on full transparency and appropriate consequences, regardless of whatever political discomfort such transparency might cause. By the time the session finally concluded late that night, the council had reached its formal decision. Lucas Grant would face formal censure and the immediate revocation of all trade privileges his family had gained through the fraudulent alliance. Advisors found to have knowingly accepted bribes would be removed permanently from their positions, and barred entirely from future council service. And the proposed marriage between Damien and Serafina, built as it entirely was on manufactured circumstances, would be formally and permanently dissolved, with no fault whatsoever attributed to Serafina herself, given the mounting evidence that she had genuinely remained unaware of her father's extensive schemes throughout. Serafina left the hall that night in stunned, heavy silence, her father following slowly behind her, his careful composure now entirely abandoned, given that his manipulation had been thoroughly exposed before the very council he had worked so hard for so long to quietly influence. Elena, who had not been present for the council session itself, received word of its dramatic outcome from Clara within a matter of hours, and she sat quietly in her small house, absorbing the significant news with a complicated mixture of emotions that took her considerable time to properly untangle. She felt no particular triumph, despite the vindication the revelation genuinely offered her. There was no real satisfaction in learning that the pain of that terrible night in the Great Hall had been built on calculated manipulation rather than any genuine necessity. If anything, the knowledge only deepened her lingering grief, transforming what she had once carefully accepted as an unfortunate but understandable political decision into something considerably closer to a deliberate betrayal, orchestrated by forces entirely outside her own control. She thought of Serafina, of the sheer horror that must have settled over her upon learning that her own father had engineered her entire engagement through deliberate deception. Whatever complicated feelings Elena might have once imagined feeling toward the woman who had taken her place at Damien's side, she found she could summon only a weary, genuinely complicated sympathy instead, understanding all too well herself exactly what it felt like to have one's entire life reshaped by decisions made without one's knowledge or consent. Clara sat with her that evening, offering quiet, steady support as Elena worked through processing the significant news. "How do you feel?" Clara asked gently, watching her friend's face carefully. "Tired," Elena admitted honestly. "Angry, in a way I genuinely didn't expect to feel. Not at Damien exactly, though I'm still carefully working through what his own responsibility in all of this truly amounts to. More at the simple idea that so much of what happened, so much of the pain I carried these past many weeks, could have been avoided entirely, if not for one man's unchecked ambition." "What will you do now?" Clara asked. Elena considered the question carefully, aware that this significant revelation changed the entire landscape of her future, in ways she had not fully anticipated when she woke that same morning. "I don't know yet, honestly. I need time to think, to properly understand what this truly means for me, separate entirely from whatever it means for Damien and the Pack's leadership going forward." Across the sprawling territory, Damien remained in his own chambers long after the exhausting council session had finally ended, drained from the weight of confronting the difficult truth so publicly, from watching Serafina's entire world crumble in real time as her father's manipulation came fully to light before everyone. He felt no real satisfaction in exposing Lucas Grant's calculated schemes, only a grim, necessary sense of duty, tempered by the sobering knowledge that this revelation, however genuinely important for the Pack's overall integrity, did absolutely nothing to undo the considerable pain Elena had already endured because of it. He understood, with growing clarity, that the truth alone was simply not enough on its own. Exposing the manipulation behind his original decision explained clearly why the crisis had felt so genuinely urgent at the time, but it did nothing whatsoever to erase the choice he himself had ultimately made, the public rejection he had personally delivered, or the many weeks of quiet, private suffering Elena had carried alone in the aftermath of it all. If he genuinely hoped for any real chance of rebuilding what had been so thoroughly broken between them, he understood clearly it would require considerably more than simply revealing the truth to the council. It would require proving, through consistent and genuinely patient action over time, that he had truly and meaningfully changed, that he valued her, not merely out of guilt or lingering obligation, but because he recognized now, more clearly than ever before, the true depth of what he had so nearly lost through his own misplaced trust and hurried, careless judgment. 3 days after the council session, Elena found herself walking toward the eastern edge of the territory, toward the modest guest house where Serafina had chosen to remain, while the fallout from her father's exposure continued settling around her family. Elena had not planned the visit in advance, had not even fully decided to make it until her feet had already carried her most of the way there, driven by some instinct she did not entirely understand herself. She knocked softly, and after a long moment, the door opened, to reveal Serafina looking considerably different than the confident, poised woman who had once stood beside Damien in the great hall. Her hair was unbound, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and something in her posture suggested a woman who had spent the past several nights getting very little genuine sleep. "Elena," Serafina said, clearly startled by the unexpected visit. "I wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't expecting to come," Elena admitted, "but I found myself here regardless. May I come in for a few minutes?" Serafina hesitated only briefly before stepping aside to allow her entry. The small guest house was sparsely furnished, clearly not intended for long-term habitation, and Elena noted the half-packed trunk sitting near the far wall, evidence of a departure already being carefully planned. "I imagine you've come to gloat," Serafina said once they were both seated, her voice carrying a brittle edge that did not quite mask the genuine vulnerability beneath it. "I wouldn't blame you if you had." "I haven't," Elena said simply. "I came because I understand, better than most people in this pack ever could, what it feels like to have your entire life reshaped by decisions made without your knowledge or consent. I wanted to see how you were faring, honestly, not out of any desire to see you suffer further." Serafina studied her for a long moment, clearly searching for some hidden motive beneath the plain sincerity of Elena's words, and finding, apparently, none. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice quiet, "about any of it. I want you to believe that, though I understand if you don't." "I believe you," Elena said, and meant it. "Damien told me the council reached the same conclusion. No fault was found against you specifically." "No fault," Serafina repeated, a hollow, humorless laugh escaping her. "And yet I've lost everything regardless. My engagement, my position, my father's trust, or whatever remained of it after learning what he actually did. I keep asking myself how I failed to see it, how I let myself become a piece moved across a board, without ever noticing the hand guiding me." "You couldn't have known," Elena said gently. "Manipulation like that is designed specifically to remain hidden from the people it benefits, not just from the people it harms. You were never meant to see it." Serafina looked at her with something like genuine surprise, as though she had expected considerably less grace from the woman whose life her own engagement had so directly upended. "Why are you being kind to me, Elena, after everything?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "Because cruelty wouldn't undo anything that happened to either of us, and because I think, if our positions had been reversed, I would want someone to extend the same grace to me. We were both used, Serafina, by circumstances neither of us fully chose or understood at the time. I don't see much value in blaming you for that, whatever else I might still be working through regarding Damien." They sat together in a quiet, uncertain silence for a while after that. Two women who had once stood as rivals, now finding an unexpected, fragile common ground in shared misfortune. Eventually, Serafina spoke again, her voice softer than before. "I'm leaving the Packlands," she said. "Within the week. There's nothing left for me here now. Not with my father's standing so thoroughly ruined, and not with the way people look at me now, as though I were somehow complicit in all of it." "Where will you go?" Elena asked. "I haven't fully decided yet," Serafina admitted. "Somewhere far from here, I think. Somewhere I can build something that belongs entirely to me, rather than something built to serve my father's ambitions." Elena felt a strange pang of recognition at those words, so closely echoing her own plans from weeks earlier, plans she herself had not entirely abandoned even now. "I understand that impulse better than you might realize," she said. "I wish you well, genuinely, wherever you end up." Serafina studied her for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, softening slightly. "Thank you," she said, "for coming here. I didn't expect kindness from you, but I'm grateful for it regardless." Elena rose to leave shortly after, and at the door, Serafina spoke once more. "For what it's worth, Elena, I don't believe Damien's feelings for you ever truly faded, even after the rejection. I noticed it long before any of this came to light, the way his attention drifted, the way he spoke your name when he thought no one else was paying close attention. I resented it at the time. I understand it a great deal better now." Elena did not know quite how to respond to that, and simply offered a small, genuine nod, before stepping out into the cool afternoon air, leaving Serafina to her half-packed trunk and her uncertain future. She walked back toward her own house slowly, turning the entire strange visit over carefully in her mind, surprised by how much lighter she felt for having made it, as though extending grace to someone she might once have resented had somehow lifted a small, unacknowledged weight from her own shoulders in the process. Clara noticed the change in her when she arrived later that evening, though Elena did not immediately explain where she had been. When she finally did share the details of her visit, Clara listened with evident surprise, then genuine admiration. "That took real courage," Clara said. "I'm not certain I could have done the same, in your position. I'm not certain I fully understood why I did it until I was already there," Elena admitted. "But I don't regret it. It felt like the right thing to do, even if I couldn't have explained exactly why beforehand." They spent the remainder of the evening together, the conversation gradually drifting toward lighter matters, though Elena found her thoughts returning, more than once, to Serafina's parting words about Damien, turning them over carefully, alongside everything else she was still working to understand about her own uncertain feelings, and about whatever might still lie ahead for her, whether within the packlands she had once been so determined to leave, or somewhere far beyond them. In the days following the council's decision, the packlands buzzed with a different kind of talk than the whispers that had once followed Elena's silent departure from the Great Hall. This time, the conversation centered on Lucas Grant, on the scale of his manipulation, on the formal censure that stripped his family of trade privileges they had held for generations. Some pack members expressed shock that such deception had gone unnoticed for so long. Others admitted, more quietly, that they had always found something faintly unsettling about the speed and convenience of the original crisis, though none had possessed the standing or the evidence to question it openly at the time. Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, spoken of differently in these renewed conversations. Where once she had been the subject of pity or quiet judgment, she now found herself regarded with something closer to respect, pack members acknowledging, in careful but genuine terms, the dignity she had shown throughout a situation none of them had fully understood until now. She did not seek this shift in perception, and she found she did not particularly need it either, though she could not deny that it eased some of the lingering discomfort she had carried through her trips to the village market in recent weeks. Nathan Hale, for his part, found himself the subject of considerable admiration throughout the pack, his careful, diligent work credited widely for bringing the truth to light. He accepted the recognition with the same quiet humility he had shown throughout the entire investigation, more focused on the fact that the truth had finally surfaced than on any personal credit it might bring him. Damien made a point of publicly acknowledging Nathan's integrity before the full council, ensuring that his contribution would not be quietly forgotten once the immediate drama of the revelation had settled. Lucas Grant himself withdrew from public life almost entirely in the days that followed, his once considerable influence within the pack reduced to little more than a cautionary tale whispered among elders discussing the dangers of unchecked ambition. He made no further attempt to defend himself before the council, seeming to understand, at least in the end, that the evidence against him left no reasonable room for denial. Whatever consequences awaited him beyond the formal censure and revoked privileges, they would unfold slowly, through the quiet erosion of standing and trust that inevitably followed a man whose deceptions had been laid bare before an entire pack. Damien, meanwhile, found himself navigating an unfamiliar kind of aftermath, one where the political crisis had been resolved, but the personal reckoning had barely begun. He met with the elders repeatedly in the days following the council session, working through the practical implications of the dissolved alliance, reassuring anxious voices that the pack's stability would not suffer for having chosen honesty over convenient deception. Slowly, steadily, those reassurances took hold, and the immediate anxiety that had gripped the pack in the wake of the revelation began giving way to a cautious, growing confidence in leadership, willing to confront uncomfortable truths rather than bury them. Through it all, Damien found his thoughts returning again and again to Elena, to the conversation beneath the old oak tree, to the careful, guarded hope he had allowed himself to feel in the wake of her measured response. He understood that the true work of rebuilding what had been broken between them still lay entirely ahead of him, and that no amount of public vindication or political success would substitute for the patient, personal effort that alone could earn back her trust. 3 days passed before Damien sought Elena out again, giving her the space he sensed she genuinely needed after the revelations that had upended so much of what she once believed about the past several months of her life. When he finally arrived at her small house, he came without ceremony, without the formal trappings of his position, simply as a man asking honestly to be heard. Elena opened the door to find him standing there, his usual composed bearing replaced by something more uncertain, more genuinely humble than she had seen from him in years. She did not immediately invite him inside, studying him for a long moment, before finally stepping back and allowing him entry into her home. They sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where Elena had once shared quiet tea with Clara on the night of the rejection, the space feeling smaller now, more charged with the weight of everything that had happened between them since that difficult night. "I wanted to speak with you properly," Damien said, before too much time passed and this conversation felt like an afterthought, rather than what it truly is meant to be. "Which is what, exactly?" Elena asked, her tone measured, neither warm nor cold, simply attentive to whatever he intended to say. "An apology," Damien said, "a real one, not simply for the manipulation I failed to recognize, but for the choice I made regardless of that manipulation. I ended our bond in front of the entire pack, without giving you any warning, without properly considering how deeply that public rejection would wound you. I told myself I was acting for the good of the pack, but I understand now that I also failed to fight hard enough for what we once shared, failed to question the pressure I was under, before it was already too late to change course." Elena listened carefully, weighing his words against the memory of that painful night, against the weeks of quiet grief and determined rebuilding that had followed it. "I appreciate the honesty," she said finally, "but an apology doesn't undo what happened, Damien. I spent weeks convincing myself that I could build a life without you, that my worth had nothing to do with whether you wanted me by your side. I meant that. I still mean it." "I know," Damien said quietly. "I'm not here asking you to forget any of that, or to pretend the past months simply didn't happen. I'm not even asking you to take me back, not today, not necessarily ever. I simply needed you to hear, directly from me, that I understand the full depth of what I did, and that I take complete responsibility for it, regardless of the manipulation that influenced my judgment at the time." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the careful political calculation she had grown accustomed to expecting from him during his time as alpha, the practiced diplomacy that so often shaped his public statements before the pack. She found none of it here, in this quiet kitchen. What she saw instead was simply a man, stripped entirely of his usual authority and confidence, offering an honest reckoning without any apparent expectation of reward for doing so. "What do you want, Damien?" she asked finally. "If not for me to take you back, then what exactly is it you're hoping for from this particular conversation?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "I want the chance to prove, through my actions rather than my words, that I've genuinely learned something from all of this. I don't expect that chance to be given to me freely, or quickly. I understand if you decide the safest path forward is the one you originally planned, building an entirely new life somewhere far from this pack and everything associated with it. But if there's any part of you still open to the possibility of something between us, I want you to know I'm willing to earn it back properly, however long that ultimately takes." Elena sat with his words for a long while, the silence between them stretching comfortably rather than tensely, both of them seemingly content to let the moment settle naturally, without rushing toward any premature resolution. Finally, she spoke again. "I won't make any promises today," she said. "I still don't fully know what I want, separate from the anger and hurt and confusion of these past several months. But I appreciate that you're not demanding an answer from me right now. That matters, more than you might realize." "That's all I'm asking for," Damien said. "Time, and the genuine chance to show you, through consistency rather than grand gestures, that I truly mean what I've said to you today." He left shortly after, without pressing further, without lingering in a way that might have felt like an attempt to extract more from the conversation than Elena had already been willing to give freely. Elena sat alone at her table for a long while after he departed, turning over everything that had passed between them, feeling the cautious, uncertain shift of something inside her that she was not yet fully ready to name aloud, even to herself. Over the following weeks, Damien made good on his promise, though not in ways that drew much attention or invited fresh gossip throughout the watchful pack. He did not send elaborate gifts or grand romantic gestures designed to win her back through mere spectacle. Instead, he showed up in small, consistent ways that spoke considerably more to genuine change than any dramatic display ever could have. He arranged, quietly and without fanfare, for the council to formally acknowledge Elena's dignity and composure during the original rejection, ensuring that the pack's collective understanding of that difficult night shifted steadily away from the whispered rumors of indifference that had followed her for weeks, toward a far more accurate recognition of the genuine strength she had shown throughout. He did not do this publicly or with any deliberate fanfare, simply ensuring, through careful conversations with key elders, that the narrative surrounding her name within the pack reflected the honest truth rather than idle speculation. He also began appearing, occasionally and entirely without pressure, at community gatherings Elena regularly attended, keeping a respectful distance rather than crowding her presence uncomfortably, offering polite greetings without ever expecting more than she was genuinely willing to give in return. He never pushed for private meetings beyond what she herself initiated, understanding clearly that rebuilding trust required considerable patience rather than persistence bordering uncomfortably on pressure. Elena noticed these small, consistent efforts, and despite her lingering, understandable caution, found herself gradually softening toward the possibility that Damien's change might genuinely run deeper than merely the crisis of the moment. She still spent considerable time with Clara, still weighed her original plans to leave the Packlands and build a fresh start elsewhere, but the certainty she had once felt so strongly about that path had given way, slowly, to something more complicated, more genuinely open to possibility than she had expected to feel again, given everything that had happened between them. Serafina, meanwhile, had withdrawn largely from pack life in the weeks following her father's exposure, choosing to remain within the guest house, near the eastern edge of the territory, only long enough to finalize her own plans before departing entirely. Elena heard occasional updates through the pack's grapevine, learning that Serafina had distanced herself completely from her father's remaining influence, working instead to rebuild her own reputation, separate from the scandal that had so thoroughly consumed her family's standing throughout the region. Elena found herself hoping, in a way that genuinely surprised her, that Serafina would find her own path forward, free of the manipulation that had shaped so much of her recent history. Whatever complicated feelings had once existed between them, tied so closely to the circumstances of Damien's original rejection, Elena understood now that Serafina had been as much a victim of her father's ambition as anyone else caught up unwittingly in the scheme, even if the full weight of that victimization had taken considerably longer to become fully clear to everyone involved. One afternoon, roughly 3 weeks after their conversation in the guest house, Elena received a brief, handwritten note delivered by a young pack messenger, unsigned but instantly recognizable by its careful, elegant script. Serafina had written simply to thank her again for the visit, and to let her know she had settled, at least temporarily, in a town along the southern coast, where she had begun the slow work of building something entirely separate from her family's tarnished name. Elena read the note twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside, feeling a quiet satisfaction that Serafina, too, seemed to be finding her own steady footing, however far from the Packlands that footing had ultimately taken her. As the weeks continued passing, Damien's patient, consistent presence in Elena's life persisted steadily, never pushing beyond what she was genuinely ready to accept, always respecting the boundaries she maintained, even as those same boundaries gradually, carefully softened over time. Elena began to notice, with a mixture of surprise and cautious hope, that the old ease between them, the comfortable familiarity that had once defined their bond so naturally before politics and pressure had ever come between them, was slowly, tentatively finding its way back into their everyday interactions. She noticed it first in small things, the way conversation between them no longer required careful navigation around forbidden topics, but flowed more naturally, touching occasionally on shared memories from before the rejection, without either of them flinching away from the reminder. The way Damien's easy humor, largely absent during the difficult weeks of council sessions and formal negotiations, began resurfacing gradually in their more casual exchanges, drawing genuine laughter from her more than once, laughter that surprised her with its own unguarded warmth. Clara observed these changes with a mixture of quiet approval and lingering protectiveness, unwilling to see her closest friend hurt again, but increasingly convinced, through her own careful observations of Damien's steady, consistent behavior, that whatever had shifted within him ran considerably deeper than a temporary reaction born of guilt or political embarrassment. "I keep waiting to see the old Damien resurface," Clara admitted one evening, as she and Elena sat together near the fire, the conversation having drifted naturally toward the subject that occupied so much of both their thoughts these days. The one who let politics and pressure crowd out everything else that mattered. "But I haven't seen him yet, not once, in all these weeks." "Neither have I," Elena admitted quietly. "I keep watching for it too, if I'm honest. Some part of me still expects it, still braces for the moment his patience runs out, or his priorities shift again toward whatever the pack demands of him next." "And if that moment never comes?" Clara asked gently. Elena considered the question for a long moment, watching the fire crackle steadily in the hearth. "Then I suppose I'll have to decide what I actually want, rather than simply what I'm protecting myself against." She did not yet know what her final answer would be. But she understood, with growing clarity, that whatever she eventually decided, it would be a choice made entirely on her own terms, shaped by her own honest understanding of what she truly wanted, rather than any pressure or expectation imposed upon her by anyone else, including the man whose patient, careful presence had slowly, steadily begun earning back a measure of the trust she had once given him so freely, so many months earlier, before everything had changed between them. One evening, Damien invited her to walk with him along the river path that bordered the western edge of the territory, a place they had once visited often together during the early days of their bond, before the demands of leadership had gradually pulled them toward busier, more crowded corners of pack life. Elena accepted the invitation without much hesitation, curious to see how the familiar path might feel now, after everything that had changed between them. The evening air carried the crisp, clean scent of approaching winter as they walked together, their pace unhurried, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Damien pointed out, at one point, a particular bend in the river where they had once spent an entire afternoon skipping stones across the water, back when such simple pleasures had still occupied a natural place in his busy schedule. "I'd forgotten about that afternoon," Elena admitted, smiling faintly at the memory as it resurfaced. "You were terrible at skipping stones, if I remember correctly." "I was," Damien agreed, laughing softly at the accurate memory. "You outmatched me easily, every single time we tried." "I had more patience for practice," Elena said. "You were always too eager to move on to the next thing." Damien considered this observation carefully as they continued walking. "That's fair criticism. I think I carried that same impatience into far too many parts of my life, including the parts that most needed my careful attention, rather than my haste." Elena glanced at him, recognizing the deeper acknowledgement beneath his simple words. "You seem different now, more willing to sit with things, rather than rushing past them." "I've had considerable reason to learn that lesson recently," Damien said quietly. "The hard way, as it happens." They continued along the river path in comfortable silence for a while longer, the fading evening light casting long shadows across the water. Elena found herself, more than once during that quiet walk, genuinely enjoying his company in a way she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge in weeks, the old ease between them resurfacing gradually, gently, without either of them forcing it. When they finally reached the point where the path curved back toward the village, Damien paused, turning to face her fully. "Thank you for walking with me tonight," he said simply. "I've missed this. Simply spending time together, without the weight of council sessions or difficult revelations hanging over every word." "So have I," Elena admitted, surprising herself slightly with the honesty of the admission. "More than I expected to, if I'm being truthful." They parted ways at the edge of the village, Damien watching her walk the remaining distance toward her small house, before finally turning back toward his own chambers, carrying with him a quiet, careful satisfaction that had little to do with politics or vindication, and everything to do with the simple, genuine warmth of an evening spent walking beside someone whose trust he was slowly, patiently learning to earn back, one honest moment at a time. 2 months passed since the council session that exposed Lucas Grant's manipulation, and the pack had settled into a new rhythm shaped by the changes that revelation had set into motion. Damien had used the intervening time not only to rebuild trust with Elena, but also to strengthen the pack's governance, implementing new safeguards designed to prevent any single family from exerting the kind of hidden influence Lucas Grant had wielded for so long without detection. He established a rotating council review process, ensuring that trade reports and territorial assessments could not be manipulated by any one source without triggering independent verification from multiple advisors working separately. He also formally recognized Nathan Hale's diligence and integrity by elevating him to a permanent senior advisory position, a fitting reward for the young advisor's willingness to pursue uncomfortable truths, despite the very real political risk involved in doing so at the time. These changes earned Damien considerable respect throughout the pack, elders and common members alike recognizing the genuine effort he had made, not simply to correct a personal mistake, but to strengthen the entire system of governance against similar manipulation occurring again in the future. His leadership, once quietly questioned in whispered conversations following the rejection scandal, now carried a renewed sense of legitimacy, built firmly on demonstrated accountability rather than mere inherited authority. Elena watched these changes unfold with quiet approval, recognizing in them the same qualities that had first drawn her to Damien years before their bond had ever formed, a genuine commitment to fairness and responsibility that extended well beyond his own personal interests. She had spent the past 2 months slowly allowing herself to trust him again, not blindly, not without appropriate caution, but gradually, through the steady accumulation of small, consistent proof that his change was genuine, rather than merely performative for her benefit. She had not yet decided whether to formally renew their bond, and Damien, true to his word, had never once pressured her toward that particular decision. Their relationship during these months existed in a careful, undefined space, neither fully reconciled nor entirely separate, built instead on a foundation of rebuilding genuine friendship and mutual respect before either of them dared to consider what might reasonably come next. Clara had watched this slow rebuilding with a mixture of hope and lingering protective caution, unwilling to see her closest friend hurt again, but increasingly convinced, through her own careful observations of Damien's consistent behavior, that his change ran considerably deeper than a temporary reaction to guilt or political embarrassment. "You seem happier," Clara observed one afternoon, as the two of them walked together through the village market, the late autumn air carrying the first genuine hints of the coming winter chill settling over the territory. Elena considered the observation, recognizing its truth even as she remained appropriately cautious about naming exactly what had shifted within her. "I think I am happier," she admitted. "Not because everything is fully resolved or entirely certain, but because I finally feel like I have real choices again, rather than simply reacting to whatever happens to me without any say in the matter." "And what do your choices look like right now?" Clara asked, her tone gentle but genuinely curious about the answer. Elena thought carefully before answering her friend. "I still think about leaving sometimes, building something entirely new, somewhere far from all the history tied to this place. But I also think about staying, about seeing where things with Damien might eventually lead, if I give it enough time and enough honest attention." "Which feels more true to what you actually want?" Clara pressed gently, watching her friend's face carefully. Elena did not have an immediate answer ready, and the two of them continued walking in comfortable silence for a while, before she finally spoke again. "I think, for the first time in a long while, I actually don't know, and I think that's all right. I don't need to have the answer right away, not anymore." That evening, Damien sought her out at her small house, as had become a regular, welcome occurrence over recent weeks. He arrived with a simple request, asking if she would be willing to walk with him toward the old oak tree at the edge of the territory, the same place where he had first shared the difficult truth about the manufactured crisis behind the original rejection months earlier. Elena agreed, curious about the purpose behind his request, though she had learned over the past months that Damien rarely asked for her time without genuine intention behind it. They walked together in comfortable quiet, the crisp evening air settling around them as they made their way slowly toward the familiar clearing. "I wanted to bring you here," Damien said, once they had reached the old tree, "because this is where I first told you the truth, and I think it's fitting that I share something else with you in this same place tonight." Elena waited, watching him carefully, sensing the weight behind whatever he was preparing himself to say. "I've spent the past 2 months trying to earn back your trust through my actions, rather than my words," he continued. "I've tried very hard not to pressure you, not to push for more than you were genuinely ready to give me. I still don't intend to pressure you tonight. But I wanted you to know, clearly and honestly, exactly where I currently stand with everything. He paused, gathering himself before continuing further. I love you, Elena. I don't think I ever truly stopped, even during the weeks I convinced myself that ending our bond was necessary for the pack's good. I understand if you're not ready to hear that, or if you need considerably more time before you can fully trust those words after everything that happened between us. But I couldn't continue letting the days pass without telling you honestly exactly how I feel. Elena stood quietly for a long moment, absorbing his words fully, feeling the weight of them settle over her, without the rush of immediate certainty she might once have expected from such a heartfelt declaration. This was not the same eager, hopeful confession a younger, less careful version of herself might have welcomed without any hesitation. This was something considerably more complicated, more layered with the history of pain and careful rebuilding that had brought them to this exact moment together. Thank you for telling me, she said finally, her voice steady, but genuinely warm. I'm not ready to say everything I feel in return, not yet. But I want you to know that I've noticed everything you've done these past 2 months. The patience, the consistency, the way you've never once pushed me toward a decision before I was truly ready to make it. That matters to me, more than grand declarations ever could. Damien nodded, accepting her measured response without any visible disappointment, understanding, as he had come to understand so much more clearly over the past several months, that Elena's careful honesty was itself a genuine gift, far more valuable than empty reassurance offered simply to smooth over the moment between them. I'm not asking you to say anything you don't genuinely feel ready to say, he said. I just needed you to know exactly where I stand, honestly and clearly, so that whatever you eventually decide going forward, you're deciding with full and complete information, rather than any lingering uncertainty about my true intentions. They stood together beneath the old oak tree, as the last light of evening faded gradually into the soft blue of early night, neither of them rushing to fill the silence with more words than the moment truly required. Elena felt, standing there, a strange and unfamiliar sense of peace settle over her. Not the complete resolution of every question that still lingered between them, but a genuine appreciation for having reached this particular point through honesty rather than pressure, through patient rebuilding rather than desperate pleading of any kind. Walk me home? She asked finally, offering him a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Always, Damien said, and the two of them began the familiar walk back toward her small house, the space between them slightly closer than it had been on the way to the clearing, though still respectful of whatever boundaries Elena had not yet chosen to fully lower. As they walked together, Elena found herself reflecting on how far she had truly come since that difficult night in the Great Hall, when she had stood before the entire pack and absorbed a rejection that had felt, at the time, like the ending of everything she had carefully built her life around. She had walked out of that hall in complete silence, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her break down before them, and that same quiet strength had carried her steadily through every difficult moment since, through the frustration of the delayed departure, through the complicated revelations of manipulation and betrayal, through the slow, careful process of deciding whether trust, once thoroughly broken, could ever truly be rebuilt between two people. In the days that followed the conversation beneath the old oak tree, Elena found herself unable to settle fully into any clear sense of direction. Damien's words had moved her more deeply than she had expected, but she recognized, with the same careful honesty she brought to every important decision, that she could not simply let his declaration alone determine her path forward. She needed something more, some way of testing her own feelings against the life she had once so firmly planned to build, before she could trust her own judgment about what came next. She spoke with Clara about the idea one evening, turning the thought over slowly as she explained it. I think I need to actually visit the coastal town, she said. The one I always spoke of before all of this began. I need to see it with my own eyes, walk its streets, imagine my life there properly, before I can honestly know whether staying here is truly my choice, or simply the easier path because it requires nothing further of me. Clara considered this carefully. That sounds wise. Will you tell Damien before you go? I think I should, Elena said, not to ask his permission, simply because I don't want to disappear without explanation, the way silence once served me in the Great Hall. This is different. This isn't about protecting myself from anyone's judgment. It's about being honest with both of us. She sought Damien out the following afternoon, finding him in the training yard overseeing a group of younger pack members practicing their forms. He excused himself immediately upon seeing her approach, and they walked a short distance away, out of earshot of the others. "I need to take a journey," Elena said, without preamble. "To the coastal town I once planned to move to, before everything changed between us. I need to see it properly, to understand what I actually want, rather than simply choosing the path that requires less of me." Damien studied her carefully, and she watched him work to keep his expression steady, to resist whatever instinct might have urged him to ask her not to go, or to insist on accompanying her. "How long will you be away?" he asked instead, his voice carefully measured. "A week, perhaps 2, Elena said. "I don't know exactly. I want to give myself enough time to know honestly, rather than rushing back before I've truly considered it." "Then I hope you find whatever clarity you're looking for," Damien said, and though she could see the effort it cost him to say the words evenly, without pleading, he managed it nonetheless. "Travel safely, Elena. I'll be here, whatever you decide, whenever you return." She left 3 days later, accompanied partway by Clara, who insisted on seeing her safely to the edge of the northern trade road before turning back toward the packlands herself. The journey took the better part of 4 days, along roads Elena had traveled only rarely in her life, through unfamiliar villages and past landscapes that gradually shifted from the rolling hills of the pack territory into the flatter, salt-scented lowlands that eventually gave way to the sea. The coastal town, when she finally arrived, proved smaller than she had imagined, from the second-hand descriptions she had gathered over the preceding months, but no less appealing for its modest size. Narrow streets wound between whitewashed houses, and the constant sound of the ocean carried through every corner of the town, a steady, rhythmic presence unlike anything she had grown up with among the inland packlands. She rented a small room above a bakery near the harbor, and spent her first days simply walking, absorbing the unfamiliar rhythms of a place that held no history for her, no memories of rejection or reconciliation, no whispered rumors following her through the streets. She spoke with shopkeepers and fishermen, learned the names of the narrow lanes, watched the fishing boats return each evening with their catch, and tried, deliberately, to imagine herself building an entire life within this quiet, unfamiliar place. She found, to her genuine surprise, that she could imagine it. The town offered a kind of peace she had not experienced in months, a freedom from the weight of history that had followed her through every corner of the packlands since the night of the rejection. She could picture herself opening a small shop, perhaps, using the practical skills she had spent years developing, building slowly the kind of independent, self-determined life she had first envisioned when she requested her release from the council all those months earlier. But she found, too, that the picture remained somehow incomplete, missing something she could not quite name until her 6th evening in the town, sitting alone on the harbor wall, watching the sun set slowly over the water. She thought of Damien's steady presence over the past months, of the walk along the river path, of his patient, consistent honesty that had never once wavered, despite every opportunity she had given him to disappoint her again. She thought of the old oak tree, of his careful words beneath its branches, of the quiet, unshakable trust that had slowly, gradually rebuilt itself between them, despite everything that had once broken it so completely. She understood, sitting there with the salt air on her face and the sound of the waves rolling steadily against the harbor wall, that the coastal town offered her a good life, a peaceful life, a life entirely her own. But it was not, she realized with sudden clarity, the life she actually wanted. It was simply the life she had built as protection, a fallback plan constructed in the immediate aftermath of devastating rejection, when she had needed somewhere to direct her wounded, determined energy. It had served its purpose well. But it was not, she now understood, her genuine choice, made freely, and without the shadow of that old pain guiding her hand. She remained in the coastal town for 3 more days, giving herself the time she had promised herself she would take, wanting to be entirely certain before she made her final decision. But by the time she packed her small bag for the return journey, she already knew, with a settled certainty that felt entirely different from the frantic determination that had first sent her toward this coastal town months earlier, exactly what she wanted to choose. The journey home felt shorter than the journey out, though the distance remained precisely the same, and Elena found herself, more than once along the road, smiling at the realization of how thoroughly her perspective had shifted since her departure. She was not returning out of obligation, or out of fear of the unknown, or even out of any lingering need to prove something to the pack that had once whispered about her silence. She was returning because she had genuinely chosen to, freely and clearly, with her eyes fully open to everything that choice would require of her going forward. Clara met her at the edge of the pack territory upon her return, having watched for her arrival each afternoon since receiving word, through a messenger Elena had sent ahead, that she was finally on her way back. Clara's face broke into a wide, relieved smile the moment she spotted Elena approaching along the road, and she hurried forward to embrace her friend warmly. "You look different," Clara observed, studying Elena's face carefully as they walked together back toward the village. "Lighter, somehow. Did you find your answer?" "I did," Elena said, a genuine settled smile touching her own face as she spoke. "I found it in the last place I expected to find it, sitting on a harbor wall, watching the sun set over the water." "Will you tell me?" Clara asked, though her expression suggested she had already guessed the answer. "I'm staying," Elena said simply. "Not because I have to. Not because leaving feels too difficult, or because I'm afraid of building something new somewhere else. I'm staying because I've realized, finally and clearly, that what I actually want is here, with Damien, in this place I once thought I needed to leave behind entirely, in order to reclaim myself." Clara squeezed her hand warmly. "I'm glad, truly. I've watched you grow so much these past months, Elena. Whatever you choose, I know it comes from real strength now, not from fear or obligation." They walked the remaining distance together in comfortable, contented silence, and Elena found herself, more than once, glancing toward the direction of Damien's chambers, wondering how best to share her decision with him, wanting the moment to carry the same honesty and clarity that had brought her to it in the first place. She did not seek him out that same evening, choosing instead to rest properly after her long journey, and to give herself one more quiet night to fully settle into the certainty she had found along the coast. But the following morning, she rose early, dressed carefully, and made her way toward the old oak tree at the edge of the territory, sending word ahead, through a young pack messenger, that she wished to meet Damien there, at the same place where so much of their careful rebuilding had unfolded over the preceding months. Damien arrived within the hour, having received her message while reviewing morning reports with the council, abandoning the meeting without hesitation the moment word reached him that Elena had returned and wished to see him. He found her already waiting beneath the wide branches of the old oak tree, the morning light catching in her hair, her expression calm and open in a way he had not seen since long before the night of the rejection. "You're back," he said, approaching slowly, searching her face for some sign of what her journey had taught her, though he was careful, as he had been careful for months now, not to press her for an answer before she was ready to give one freely. "I am," Elena said. "And I have something I'd like to tell you, if you're ready to hear it." "I've been ready for months," Damien said quietly, though he made no move to close the distance between them, allowing her the space to approach the moment however she chose to. Elena took a slow breath, gathering the same steady clarity that had settled over her on the harbor wall days earlier. "I went to the coastal town to find out whether I truly wanted to leave, or whether I had simply built a plan to leave, because it was the only thing that felt like mine to control, back when everything else had been taken from me without my consent. I needed to know the difference before I trusted myself to choose anything at all." "And what did you find?" Damien asked, his voice carefully steady despite the hope he could not entirely keep from his eyes. "I found a good life waiting there, if I wanted it," Elena said. "Quiet, peaceful, entirely my own. But I also found, sitting there watching the sun go down over water I'd never seen before, that it wasn't actually what I wanted. It was what I'd built to protect myself, back when protecting myself was the only thing I knew how to do. And I don't need that kind of protection anymore, Damien. Not from you. Not anymore." Damien felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had carried since the night of the rejection finally beginning to ease. "What do you want then?" he asked softly. "I want to stay," Elena said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not because I need you to make my life complete, and not because I've forgotten what happened between us. I'll carry that history with me, regardless of what I choose. But I've watched you, these past months, prove yourself, through patience, rather than promises, through consistency, rather than grand gestures, and I've realized that what I actually want, freely and clearly, is to build something new with you, here, in the place that's always been my home. Damien closed the distance between them then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished to. She did not step back. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers curling around his, with a certainty that carried none of the fragile hesitation of their earlier months of careful rebuilding. "I promise you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I will spend every remaining day earning the choice you've just made. I will not take it for granted, not for a single moment." "I know," Elena said, and the simple certainty in her voice told him she meant it completely. "That's exactly why I'm choosing it." They stood together beneath the old oak tree for a long while after that, saying little more, content simply to exist in the quiet, settled peace of a choice finally, freely made. Word of Elena's return, and of the reconciliation that followed, spread through the packlands within days, though this time, the whispers carried none of the confused speculation that had once surrounded her silent departure from the Great Hall so many months earlier. Instead, the story that circulated spoke of a woman who had left to find her own answer, and returned only once she had found it honestly, choosing a future built on her own terms rather than anyone else's expectations of her. Winter settled fully over the packlands in the weeks that followed, the bare branches of the old oak tree at the territory's edge, now dusted with the season's first proper snowfall. Elena had returned from the coastal town with a clarity that only deepened as the days passed, and the tentative rebuilding that had defined her relationship with Damien for so many months began, slowly and naturally, giving way to something steadier, something both of them were finally ready to name openly, before the pack that had watched their entire journey unfold. Damien did not rush toward any grand announcement, understanding by now, after everything they had endured together, that Elena valued substance over spectacle in every part of her life. Instead, he simply continued showing up, day after day, with the same patient consistency that had first begun earning back her trust months earlier, only now that consistency carried the easy warmth of two people who had genuinely chosen each other, rather than the careful caution of two people still testing whether trust could be rebuilt at all. Clara had watched this final settling with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had supported her closest friend through every difficult step of the journey, from the silent walk out of the Great Hall to the harbor wall overlooking unfamiliar waters. "I never thought I'd say this," she admitted one evening, as the two of them sat together near the fire in Elena's small house, the winter wind rattling gently against the shuttered windows. "But I think he's actually earned the chance you've given him. Properly earned it, not just been handed it." Elena smiled at the observation, appreciating her friend's honesty more than she could easily express. "I think so too, and I think, more importantly, that I've earned my own certainty about it. This isn't the same as before, Clara. I'm not simply accepting whatever comes my way this time. I chose this, deliberately, with my eyes fully open." "I know," Clara said. "That's exactly why I trust it." A few weeks later, on a clear, cold evening beneath a sky bright with stars, Elena and Damien returned once more to the old oak tree, the place that had become, over the many months since the night of the rejection, a quiet marker of every significant turning point in their long, careful journey back toward each other. This time, Damien had asked her to come, not for another difficult conversation, but for something he had been carefully planning for weeks, wanting the moment to be exactly right. "I've thought a great deal about how to do this properly," he said, once they had reached the familiar clearing, snow crunching softly beneath their feet. "I considered a grand ceremony, something the whole pack could witness, the way our original bond was formed. But I don't think that's what either of us actually needs this time." Elena watched him carefully, curious about where this was leading, though she found she was not anxious the way she once might have been. The trust between them had grown too solid for that particular kind of uncertainty. "I want to ask you something," Damien continued, "not as your alpha, and not in front of the entire pack, simply as the man who nearly lost the most important thing in his life through his own carelessness, and who has spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of a second chance." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, simple item, nothing elaborate, nothing designed to impress through wealth or spectacle, but something Elena recognized immediately, with a sudden rush of emotion. It was the smooth river stone he had once given her during the earliest days of their original bond, the one she had thought lost years ago during one of their many moves between chambers. "I found this while going through old belongings a few weeks ago," Damien said, his voice carrying a rare, unguarded vulnerability. I'd kept it, all this time, without fully realizing it, and I thought, when I found it again, that it belonged with you, rather than tucked away in some forgotten drawer. Elena took the stone from his outstretched hand, turning it over in her palm, feeling the same smooth, familiar weight she remembered from years earlier, from easier days before politics and pressure had ever come between them. I thought I'd lost this, she said softly. I think, in a way, we both lost quite a lot, Damien said. And I think, in a way, we've both found our way back to what actually matters. I'm not asking you to renew our bond tonight, Elena. I know that decision deserves its own proper time and consideration, when you're ready for it. I simply wanted you to have this back, as a reminder that some things, once genuinely valued, are worth holding on to through whatever difficulty comes. Elena closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its familiar weight settle into her palm, as though it had never truly left. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion she made no attempt to hide, for understanding what this actually means, rather than turning it into something grander than it needs to be. They stood together beneath the old oak tree for a long while after that, the stars bright overhead, the cold air sharp and clean, both of them content simply to exist together in the quiet, hard-won peace they had built through months of honesty, patience, and genuine effort on both sides. The formal renewal of their bond took place some weeks later, in a smaller, quieter ceremony than the grand political spectacle that had once marked Damien's ill-fated engagement to Serafina. Elena stood before the pack this time, not as a woman accepting whatever fate circumstance had handed her, but as someone who had chosen, deliberately and with full understanding of everything that had come before, to build a future she genuinely wanted for herself, on her own terms, at her own pace. Clara stood proudly among the witnesses, watching her closest friend step into this new chapter with the same steady composure that had carried her through every difficult moment of the preceding year. Nathan Hale, now firmly established as one of the pack's most trusted advisors, watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing his own diligence had played a crucial role in bringing the truth to light that ultimately made this reconciliation possible. Even a brief letter arrived from the coastal town, unsigned but unmistakably from Serafina, offering quiet congratulations and genuine well wishes for whatever future Elena had chosen to build. Elena caught Damien's eye as the ceremony concluded, and the warmth she found there, genuine and steady, free of the political calculation that had once shadowed even his most sincere moments, told her everything she needed to know about the choice she had made, and about the choice she would continue making, day after day, for however many years lay ahead of them. She thought back, in that quiet moment, to the night she had walked out of the great hall in complete silence, refusing to let the pack witness her breaking beneath the weight of public rejection. She had not known then, standing alone in the cold evening air, with her dignity as her only armor, that this same quiet strength would eventually become the very thing that brought the Alpha King to his knees, pleading not for power or convenience, but for a genuine second chance to build something real and lasting between them. Her silence had never been weakness. It had been the foundation of everything that followed, the unshakable core of self-respect that had carried her through humiliation, through uncertainty, through betrayal, through the long journey to a distant coastline and back again, until she finally stood here, not as a woman who had simply been rejected and reclaimed by someone else's choice, but as one who had chosen, entirely on her own terms, exactly the life and the love she genuinely wanted to build for herself. As the pack celebrated around them, warm lantern light pushing back against the winter darkness, Elena felt the smooth weight of the small river stone, still tucked carefully into the pocket of her gown, a quiet, private reminder of everything they had rebuilt together, piece by patient piece, from the ashes of a single silent walk, out of a hall that had once tried, and failed, to define her by someone else's rejection. She reached for Damien's hand, and he took it without hesitation, and together they turned to face whatever came next, not as alpha and rescued mate, but as two equals who had each, in their own way, learned exactly what real strength looked like, and had chosen, freely and deliberately, to build their future on nothing less than that foundation. In the days leading up to the formal ceremony, Elena found herself reflecting often on how differently this preparation felt from the wedding preparations that had once consumed the pack in the weeks before Damien's original announcement with Serafina. There was no rush timeline this time, No pressure from outside families demanding urgency. No undercurrent of political necessity shaping every decision. Instead, the preparations unfolded at a pace that felt entirely natural, shaped by what Elena and Damien themselves genuinely wanted, rather than what circumstance demanded of them. She spent one particular afternoon with Clara, sorting through fabric samples for the simple gown she intended to wear, laughing more freely than she had, in what felt like a very long time. "Do you remember," Clara said, holding up a bolt of deep blue wool against the window light, "when you told me you never wanted anyone to see you break? I keep thinking about that, watching you now. You never did break, not once, through any of it." "I came close, some nights," Elena admitted honestly. "There were evenings I sat alone in my house and felt the whole weight of it pressing down on me. But you're right that I never let anyone see it. I think, looking back, that mattered more than I understood at the time. It gave me something to stand on, later, when I needed to decide what I actually wanted, rather than simply reacting to what had been taken from me." "Do you think you would have made the same choice if you'd cried that night in the hall?" Clara asked, genuinely curious. Elena considered the question carefully. "I don't know, maybe, but I don't think I would have trusted myself the same way." The silence wasn't just about denying Damien a reaction. It was about proving to myself that I could hold steady, even when everything around me was falling apart. I needed that proof, I think, more than I needed anyone else's sympathy. They continued their preparations through the afternoon, and Elena found herself grateful, not for the first time, that she had a friend who had never once tried to rush her through any part of the long journey that had brought her to this point, who had simply walked alongside her, patient and steady, through every difficult turn. Damien, meanwhile, spent those same weeks attending to the practical matters of pack leadership that never fully paused, regardless of personal milestones. The Eastern Territory agreements, finally and properly resolved months earlier, continued functioning smoothly under the new safeguards he had implemented, and the trade relationships once threatened by Lucas Grant's manipulation had gradually stabilized under honest, transparent dealings. Nathan Hale had proven himself an invaluable advisor in these matters, his careful attention to detail ensuring that no similar deception could easily take root again within the council's proceedings. Damien found time, despite the ongoing demands of leadership, to visit the old advisor who had once counseled him about the reckoning that inevitably follows a difficult decision. The old man, now well into his later years, received him warmly, listening with evident pleasure as Damien described the path that had led him back to Elena. "I told you the reckoning would come," the advisor said, a faint smile touching his weathered face. "I did not expect it to bring you somewhere better than where you started, though I'm glad to see that it has. I nearly lost everything that mattered, chasing what I believed the pack needed," Damien admitted. "I'm grateful, more than I can properly express, that the chance to correct that mistake was given to me at all." "Not given," the old advisor corrected gently. "Earned. There is a difference, and I think you understand it now better than most leaders ever come to understand it in their lifetime." Damien carried those words with him, in the days that followed, turning them over during quiet moments, understanding their truth more deeply, each time he considered them. He had not been given a second chance freely. He had earned it, slowly and deliberately, through months of patient, consistent effort that asked nothing of Elena beyond the space to prove himself honestly. The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and cold, sunlight glinting sharply off the fresh snow that blanketed the packlands. Elena woke early, the small river stone resting on the table beside her bed, where she had kept it since the evening Damien returned it to her, beneath the old oak tree. She held it for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight, before rising to begin the quiet rituals of preparation that would carry her toward the ceremony ahead. Clara arrived shortly after, helping her into the simple, deep blue gown they had chosen together weeks earlier, weaving small winter flowers through her hair, with the same careful attention she had brought to every part of this long journey alongside her closest friend. "You look ready," Clara said, studying her in the mirror. "Not just dressed for the occasion, actually ready." "I am," Elena said, and meant it completely. "I've never been more certain of anything." The ceremony itself unfolded with a quiet dignity that stood in sharp contrast to the grand, politically charged announcement that had once ended Elena's original bond before the entire watching pack. There were no elaborate declarations about alliances or strategic necessity this time. No calculated timing designed to serve anyone's ambitions beyond the genuine wishes of the two people standing at its center. The elders who gathered to witness the renewal did so not out of political obligation, but out of genuine respect for a journey they had watched unfold over many difficult months, from silent rejection to hard-won, freely chosen reconciliation. When the formal words had finally been spoken and the bond properly renewed, the pack gathered for a celebration considerably warmer and more genuine than the tense, uncertain festivities that had followed the original, ill-fated announcement so many months earlier. Lanterns were strung throughout the village square, much as they had been on the night of the season's gathering when Elena and Damien had first exchanged their brief, careful words of reconciliation. Music drifted through the cold evening air, and laughter carried easily between neighbors who had, over the long course of this story, come to understand something important about the woman whose silence had once so thoroughly confused them. Elena moved through the celebration with an ease she had not felt in the Packlands for a very long time, greeting old friends, accepting warm congratulations, catching Damien's eye more than once across the crowded square, and finding, each time, the same steady warmth reflected back at her. Clara remained close throughout the evening, and at one point, as the celebration reached its fullest warmth, she leaned close to Elena's ear. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Not for choosing him. For choosing yourself, first, every step of the way, until choosing him became something that belonged entirely to you, rather than something handed to you by circumstance." Elena squeezed her friend's hand, unable to find words adequate to the depth of gratitude she felt. Later that evening, as the celebration began winding down and the coldest hours of the night settled over the Packlands, Damien found her standing near the edge of the square, watching the lanterns flicker gently against the darkness. "Any regrets?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Elena considered the question, though she already knew her answer. "None," she said. "Not about the silence in that hall, not about the months of uncertainty that followed, not about the journey to the coast, and certainly not about tonight. Every difficult part of it led me here, to a choice that belongs entirely to me." "I'm grateful for that silence, more than I can properly express," Damien said quietly. "It taught me more about real strength than anything I learned in all my years of leadership training." Elena smiled, leaning into him slightly, as the lanterns continued their steady, warm flicker against the winter darkness. Then perhaps it served its purpose exactly as it needed to. They stood together a while longer, watching the last of the celebration fade gently into the quiet, peaceful hours of the night. Two people who had each, through very different journeys, arrived at the same hard-won understanding. That the strongest foundations are never built on rejection, reversed through pleading, but on two people choosing each other honestly, freely, and completely, with full knowledge of everything that had come before, and full confidence in everything still to come.